Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Separated by the Border, a birth mother, a foster mother, and a migrant child's 3,000-mile journey by Gina Thomas. This is from the introduction. How good is your Spanish? And would you be able to take in a 4-year-old girl? She's from Honduras and speaks minimal English. The social worker had texted me on a Friday afternoon. I sat at my desk, bent over my cell phone, reading and rereading the text. My thoughts traveled to Honduras, bachata, ballades, clothes hanging on the line. So many things in our lives seem to have prepared us for this moment. My son was attending a bilingual school. I'm a former ESL teacher, and my husband Andrew and I speak Spanish. Plus, Honduras already had a piece of my heart. As those thoughts came, I tried to push them away. The voice of logic came in loud and strong. We had just gotten into a routine with Emma, our foster daughter. 2 foster children and 2 biological children would be too much for us to handle. Our first month as foster parents taught us this, and for the sake of everyone involved, we knew it would be very unfair to try that again. A little later, the social worker called and left me a message saying, "It looks like the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the ORR, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, will get her on Monday in court. It'll only be the weekend. Call me back after you talk to Andrew." I asked Andrew when I got home, "We can manage 4 kids for one weekend, right?" He said he doubted it would last only a weekend, but I convinced him that if ORR and ICE were involved, they would get her on Monday. A few minutes later, I called our social worker and said that we'd do it. When I walked into the social worker's office, Julia was sitting there in a brand new bright pink Barbie t-shirt. The social worker said they'd found the t-shirt in their clothing closet and Julia wanted it. Beautiful, soft onyx curls framed the girl's umber face. Her dark complexion made me speculate she was from a coastal region. She stood in dirty flip-flops next to the social worker's chair, chit-chatting away in Spanish without a care in the world. "Julia's been talking my ear off," the social worker said. "She's so sweet, but I have no idea what she's saying." Another worker brought in a black tote bag with a few other items from the clothing closet, including a pair of sequined high-top sneakers that Julia had picked out. I began to speak to Julia, pronounced Julia, in Spanish. She seemed happy to hear her mother tongue, but her body language didn't budge. I read that signal loud and clear, so I kept my distance and sat down on the floor. "¿Cómo se llama?" I asked. "Julia." "¿Cuántos años tienes? How old are you?" "Cuatro, 4. She looked older than 4 to me. I had been told her parents were deported and she was left behind. She was under federal jurisdiction. I would find out later this was all misinformation. I signed some papers and said, "We'll see you on Monday." I asked Julia if she would come stay with me and my family for the weekend. She smiled. I told her I had 3 other kids. Her eyes expanded with excitement. On the drive home, she jolted my Spanish from its slumber. The social worker wasn't kidding about how much this little one talked. On April 6, 2018, U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced a new zero-tolerance policy in which the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice would partner for the sake of prosecuting illegal entry into the United States. Sessions said, quote, "If you cross this border unlawfully, then we will prosecute you. It's that simple. If you smuggle aliens across our border, then we will prosecute you. If you are smuggling a child, then we will prosecute you, and that child will be separated from you as required by law. If you don't like that, then don't smuggle children over our border," end quote. 6 weeks later, almost 2,000 children had been separated from their parents at the border since the zero-tolerance policy took effect. When Sessions announced the administration's new policy, I couldn't comprehend the cruelty. I also wondered if it explained why a preschooler was living under my roof. Julia had come to live with me and my family in February of 2018, and it felt surreal to be a part of her story. She had first been separated from her mother, Guadalupe, called by her nickname Lupe through the rest of this book, by smugglers who were paid to bring them across the border. Julia had then been separated from her stepfather, Carlos, by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, likely because what was recognized by the Honduran government as stepfather was not recognized by the U.S. government as the same, a detail I didn't understand until an immigration expert read the first draft of this book and explained it. Julia had already suffered much trauma, and separating her from her stepfather had only inflicted more. The weight of the trauma that we, as a nation, began inflicting on vulnerable children and their parents was cruel and unusual punishment. When I heard that my own country was going to begin separating children regularly from their parents as a policy, it broke me. Reality became surreal, and Andrew and I learned to live in it, separating the trauma from our emotions so that we could survive. As the veil of Oz is ever lifting from my white evangelical American eyes, what I now see is simply heartbreaking. Government-secured human rights are mostly for privileged white people. Julia is not white. Julia is undocumented. Julia's first language is Spanish. Julia is a girl. These are all labels that set her back in a society made by and for white, passport-holding, English-speaking males. But God, who is neither white nor male, despite my use of the pronoun he, shines his good news on every human being alike. The book is Separated by the Border by Gina Thomas. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Yep, it's Guy Fawkes Day, also known as Gunpowder Treason Day and Fireworks Night, November 5th, 1605, the day that Guy Fawkes tried to, the Catholic Guy Fawkes, tried to blow up the Protestant-controlled English House of Parliament. Amazing. I mean, it's amazing that it endures to this day. It's really a commentary. I guess on British history. I think a good thing, or a good commentary. Good to remember your history. Anyhow, we've got a lot on the program today, and we're going to get into a whole lot of topics. I've got a pile of news. We've got some impeachment stuff. We've got we're going to have a guest talking about PG&E and privatizing it or publicizing, making it a public company or whatever. I've got a riff here for you about how Democrats need to be messaging and languaging. I mean, there's a lot going on, but I want to start out with a straw poll. We've been trying to do one of these every other month, more or less, and it's been about a month and a half, maybe even 2 months since the last time we did it. And so here's how it works. My question for you. And we're not taking any calls right now, and Joyce is not answering phones or anything. It's just, I'm just going to do this. So, if anybody's on hold right now, they're going to get dumped. Just give us a call at 202-808-9925. I will put you on the air from my console here. I'll put you on the air, and I'll call out your area code, as we get caller ID here. And what I'd like to know is who you're inclined to vote for. If you were voting in the Democratic primary tomorrow or today, I mean, today is election day, right? So if you were but if it was the Democratic primary today in your state, and it's not anywhere right now, but there are elections happening all over the country, A, who would you vote for? And B, give us a sentence or two. Now, if anybody talks for more than 10 or 15 seconds, I'm just gonna move on to the next caller. But actually, it looks like my call screen software is telling me where you're calling from rather than the number. Well, actually, I've got both, but I'll just say where you're calling from and put you on the air and just, let us know who would you be voting for, and very, very briefly, why. So Caller in Tennessee, who would you be voting for and why?
Probably Bernie because of his thing in monkey rights and the tarantulas.
Monkey, okay, I don't know what that is, but maybe he thinks he's being funny. Caller in Richmond, Oakland, California.
So I have a tie between Warren and Harris, and I think because they both are incredibly intelligent women, but I think they can gather and garner support from the youth and also all colors and shades of the Democratic Party.
Okay, thank you. In Vermont, you're on the air.
I'm on the air.
You are on the air. Who would you vote for and why?
I would vote for Bernie because he is honest and has been honest for 40-plus years.
Thank you. Tim, excuse me, in Seattle. You've called before, so it comes up with your name, too. Caller in Seattle, who would you vote for and why?
100% Bernie Sanders. He's the only one truly independent. He's the one that's kicked off all of this stuff. Warren and everybody can pretend that they've been on the charge the whole time, but it hasn't been. It's only been Bernie.
Okay, thank you. Paul, in Lucerne, California. You're on the air. Who would you vote for and why? Caller in Lucerne, California?
Yes.
Yes. Who would you vote for and why? You're on the air.
Elizabeth Warren, and I'd vote for her because she was my first choice for the progressives.
Okay, great. Thank you. Concord, California. Who would you call for? Who would you vote for and why?
I would vote for Bernie because of his proven record.
Okay, thank you very much. I should, by the way, for if those of you who are listening to your radio, there's a 10 or 15 second delay between the time that you and I talk and the time that it appears on the radio because it goes through an obscenity delay. So if somebody drops a bad word, we can just push a button and it vanishes. So don't expect to hear yourself on the radio. Just listen to your phone. In Osceola, Wisconsin, who would you vote for and why?
Elizabeth Warren, because I think she's got plans.
Okay.
And she's honest.
Great, thank you. And Joyce, I hope you're keeping track of these. In Calumet, Michigan, who would you vote for and why?
Bernie Sanders. He is definitely steadfast in his policies. He's progressive, and he's trustworthy.
Great, thank you very much. We're doing this straw poll here. 202-808-9925 is our telephone number. Palm Springs, California. Who would you vote for and why?
Elizabeth Warren, because we really need to shoot for the moon.
Okay, thank you very much. Seattle, who would you call for, who would you vote for and why?
I would vote for Elizabeth Warren because I believe she has integrity.
Okay, thank you. Lomita, California, who would you vote for and why?
I'd vote for Bernie Sanders because he has good enough sense to pick Elizabeth Warren as his running mate.
Okay, thank you. San Francisco, who would you vote for and why?
I'd vote for Elizabeth because corruption.
Okay.
Somebody that'll do away with it. Thank you.
Got it. Thank you. Wilmington, North Carolina. Who would you vote for and why?
Senator Sanders is worthy of my ongoing continued support for his great progressive record.
Okay. Thank you. Detroit or Pontiac, Michigan. Who would you vote for and why?
Hi, I would vote for Bernie, and it's because he's been consistent with his message on how to keep America progressive for the last 30 years.
Okay, thank you. Illinois, who would you vote for and why?
Hi, this is Jeannie from Brookfield, Illinois. I would vote for Bernie because he wrote the damn bill.
Okay, thank you. Santee, California, who would you vote for and why?
Bernie Sanders because of his consistency in his voting record.
Okay. Portland, Oregon, who would you vote for and why?
Bernie, because I trust him to be for the people.
Okay. Belfair, Washington, who would you vote for and why?
I'd vote for Bernie Sanders for his honesty and his integrity.
Okay. British Columbia, Canada, who would you vote for and why?
Bernie Sanders because he is honest and he is for the people, unrelenting for the people.
Okay. Madison, Wisconsin, who would you vote for and why?
I would vote for Pete Buttigieg because he's the exact opposite of Donald Trump.
Okay, thank you. Kent or Tacoma, Washington. Who would you vote for and why?
And Bernie, because he's the one who can win. Knocking on doors yesterday, I met 2 Republicans who would vote for Bernie.
Okay, thank you. Auburn or Tacoma, Washington. Who would you vote for and why?
Bernie, no BS, man. I like the straight talk.
Okay, thank you. Seattle, who would you vote for and why? Hello, Seattle? You're on the air? Oh, maybe not. San Jose, California, who would you vote for and why?
Bernie, because he will solve the underlying causes of problems rather than just some surface corrections.
Okay. So, we've had our little straw poll here. I'm going to end it right now. We'll Joyce will be tabulating this stuff up, and I'll get back with you on what we're finding out, and Joyce will start actually just taking your calls if you want to comment on. We can have a little more long-form discussion on these issues. Who would you vote for and why? And
this
what's the state of the
Thom Hartmann Program.
And what's the state of the election, really? So if you'd like to talk about that, give us a shout, 202-808-9925. I do have some news stories that I want to share with you when we get back, so stick around. And welcome back. Andy in Grand Rapids. Hey, Andy, what's on your mind today?
Tom, Elizabeth with Bernie as backup for progressive policies.
Okay, and we're kind of in long-form context here now. Andy, if Elizabeth Warren is your first choice, who would be your second choice or your third choice? Or Andrew?
Bernie's definitely my second.
Okay, and do you have a third?
Maybe Pamela Harris.
Kamala Harris?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Great. All righty. We're off to a start here. Joyce, you could be screening these calls. Shayna in Prairie Grove, Arkansas. Hey, Shayna. Thank you, Joyce. Hey, Shayna, you're on the air. What's up?
Hi,
Thanks for watching Free Speech
Elizabeth,
TV.
Thanks. Elizabeth Warren, number 1. Bernie Sanders, 2. She's got a plan for that. Go progressive and vote blue no matter who.
Yeah. I'm curious, who were you supporting 4 years ago?
Clinton. No, I have Bernie Sanders, but
in the primary.
Clinton.
Yeah, and then
Bernie Sanders
just like me, supporting Bernie, and then when Hillary Clinton became the candidate, strongly supporting her. Is it your sense that this election is going to be different? I mean, what is your sense of how this primary is probably going to play out, Shannon?
I think it's going to be different. I think that we all know that we need big ideas. We can't just go with a corporate Democrat. We have to go big.
Yeah. I keep hearing on MSNBC in particular, all these pundits and some of the hosts themselves saying, well, if the Democrats nominate Bernie or Elizabeth Warren, they're going to lose terribly because, that happened to George McGovern back in the day, and, quack, quack, quack.
I know. They said the same thing with Hillary, remember?
Yeah, that's true.
It didn't work that time. So
yeah.
We got to go big.
Yeah, well, Hillary, I mean,
we don't have time to mess around, especially with the climate.
Yeah, I agree. And the thing that we need to keep reminding ourselves is that Hillary actually got 3 million more votes than Donald Trump. We have a guy who's only in the White House because of an electoral college that was organized to elect, what was it, 10 of the first 11 presidents were slaveholders, or 7 of the first 8, something like that. Is some, mind-boggling number, and that's why we have the electoral college was to protect the slave owning class, as it were, or the class of white men who were enslaving other human beings, to make it more specific.
And we need to get rid of that too.
Yeah. And the only thing that's stopping that from going away, I mean, there's 3 or 4, maybe only 2 or 3 Republican-controlled states, Texas would be high on that list, that have enough electoral votes that if they signed on to this fairvote.org thing where the state commits that its electoral votes will go to whoever wins the national vote, whoever wins the majority nationally. You know, they only need a couple more states to do this, but all of the Republican-controlled states are saying no. It's only the democratically controlled states that are saying, yeah, the majority of the people should decide. And that, I think, tells you pretty much everything you need to know about both those things. Shana, thanks for the call. And thanks for watching Free Speech TV there in Arkansas. Yeah, good talking to you. Love you. Thank you. Back at you. We'll be back in just a second. It's 19 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Stick around. We'll be right back. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Okay, here's our quickie straw poll. Not surprising. I mean, I have to remind new listeners in particular that for 11 years on this program has been on the air. I think we're in our 16th year. We started 15 plus years ago, 16 years ago, and in the first 11 years of our being on the air. Or maybe not the first year. I'd have to go back and look when Bernie started being on the show. But for 11 years on this program, Bernie Sanders was on our show every Friday. I mean, we did a Friday after Thanksgiving once. We did a Friday the day before Christmas once. I mean, Bernie showed up every single Friday. I think without fail. I mean, other than when even once from outside the country. Calling in on a satellite phone. He was here every Friday for 11 years, answering calls, answering your calls, just like Mark Pocan and Ro Khanna do right now. Mostly Mark Pocan. We're doing, every Wednesday, Congressman Pocan comes on and we do middays with Mark. With Bernie, it was called Brunch with Bernie. So, my audience, my long-term audience, people who've been with us for a long time, people who've been listening to the show for a long time, they're going to skew toward Bernie, I would guess, just because of that history, although it has been 4 or 5 years since Bernie was on. I mean, he stopped doing this when he declared he was running for the Democratic primary. But here's the results. 1 vote for Pete Buttigieg, 1 vote for Kamala Harris, 6 votes for Elizabeth Warren, 16 votes for Bernie. So Bernie beats Warren by a little more than 2-1, and the two of them just basically swamped everybody else. And I realize, we didn't do it long enough to really get a large number of people. But on the other hand, people listening to the radio I don't think they want to hear just, call after call saying, this person, that person. So I mentioned there's a bunch of news stories that I wanted to share with you. Well, actually, in fact, I wanted to get your thoughts on this as well. There's a guy in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who his name is Mahoud Villaluz, Villaluz. I'm probably mispronouncing it. It's a Spanish name. He was originally born in Peru, but he came to the United States as a kid. He got his U.S. citizenship. He is a full citizen of the United States and speaks English and all that kind of stuff. And this guy, he took a parking spot apparently in a mall, in a shopping center, and some other guy wanted that parking spot. And when the other guy parked, he came up to this guy, to Mahoud, and said, you're an illegal, go back to your country. In fact, Mahood says he started arguing, saying, why did you come here and invade my country? Why did you come here illegally? And I said, sir, I don't know why, you don't know my status. I'm a U.S. citizen too. And then he got mad when I told him everybody came here from somewhere else. And then this guy throws acid in the face of this young man. Well, he's 42 years old. And he's got second-degree burns on his face from having acid thrown on him. Because there was surveillance video, they were able to arrest a 61-year-old man. We don't have his name yet. And, you know, he's going to be charged with a hate crime. But, I mean, the mayor of Milwaukee, Tom Barrett, yesterday, I mean, this happened, I believe, over the weekend. I think it was Sunday. The mayor of Milwaukee said that that Donald Trump is responsible for this. That these violent hate crimes like this acid attack are the result of Donald Trump's rhetoric. The mayor said everybody knows what's happening. It's because the president is talking about it on a daily basis. People feel that they have license to go after Hispanic people, and it's wrong. I've got, you know, I mean, this kind of came home to Louise and I. Our next door neighbor was awakened at 11:30 at night by police at her door saying, you know, where's the gun? And she was like, I don't have a gun. I don't know what you're talking about. And they said, well, we got this 911 call that this guy was threatening somebody with a gun. And it turns out it was the neighbor, you know, it was one house over. They had the wrong address. But one of our neighbors threatened another one of our neighbors with a gun. Or threatened to get a gun and threaten him with a gun. And then the other neighbor also has a gun, and so he threatened to get his gun. And it's like, and then one of them called the police. And I mean, I believe these are, at least one of these people I know is a big Fox News watcher. I'm not sure about the other. And it's like, is this happening in your neighborhood too? I mean, people just exploding at each other? Is this happening in your family? I mean, are we now like sensitized to this because, you know, Trump went down to Florida and, you know, said, what should we do about these illegals? And somebody said, shoot them. And Trump made a joke about it and laughed about it and said, you know, you can only get away with that here in the panhandle of Florida. But cool. And then, you know, right after that, this guy travels 600 miles down to El Paso, Texas, looking to hunt Hispanic people and kills 28 people, as I recall. Are you seeing this too? This growing violence, or not necessarily violence, but threats of violence, like, you know, my two neighbors who were threatening each other. And by the way, this was over leaves. One guy was raking his leaves, and the other guy says, you got some leaves in my yard, and threatens to get his gun. It's like, what do we do as a country? What has happened to us as a country? And what is stoking this? I mean, am I overestimating the power of right-wing hate media when I say that I think that right-wing hate radio and Fox News has something to do with this? Or am I just, you know, blaming everything on the guys that I don't like, you know, on the other side, on the other political side, as it were? Are you discovering that people may be coming together now because of Trump rather than being torn apart?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
You know, we have certainly had that experience too. Louise was talking to somebody on a plane the other day, and you know, they started kind of bonding around not liking Trump, and then somebody behind him started yelling, "You can't talk about the president like that." It was bizarre.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Separated by the Border, a birth mother, a foster mother, and a migrant child's 3,000-mile journey by Gina Thomas. This is from the introduction. How good is your Spanish? And would you be able to take in a 4-year-old girl? She's from Honduras and speaks minimal English. The social worker had texted me on a Friday afternoon. I sat at my desk, bent over my cell phone, reading and rereading the text. My thoughts traveled to Honduras, bachata, ballades, clothes hanging on the line, So many things in our lives seem to have prepared us for this moment. My son was attending a bilingual school. I'm a former ESL teacher, and my husband Andrew and I speak Spanish. Plus, Honduras already had a piece of my heart. As those thoughts came, I tried to push them away. The voice of logic came in loud and strong. We had just gotten into a routine with Emma, our foster daughter. 2 foster children and 2 biological children would be too much for us to handle. Our first month as foster parents taught us this, and for the sake of everyone involved, we knew it would be very unfair to try that again. A little later, the social worker called and left me a message saying, "It looks like the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the ORR, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, will get her on Monday in court. It'll only be the weekend. Call me back after you talk to Andrew." I asked Andrew when I got home, "We can manage 4 kids for one weekend, right?" He said he doubted it would last only a weekend, but I convinced him that if ORR and ICE were involved, they would get her on Monday. A few minutes later, I called our social worker and said that we'd do it. When I walked into the social worker's office, Julia was sitting there in a brand new bright pink Barbie t-shirt. The social worker said they'd found the t-shirt in their clothing closet and Julia wanted it. Beautiful, soft onyx curls framed the girl's umber face. Her dark complexion made me speculate she was from a coastal region. She stood in dirty flip-flops next to the social worker's chair, chit-chatting away in Spanish without a care in the world. "Julia's been talking my ear off," the social worker said. "She's so sweet, but I have no idea what she's saying." Another worker brought in a black tote bag with a few other items from the clothing closet, including a pair of sequined high-top sneakers that Julia had picked out. I began to speak to Julia, pronounced Julia, in Spanish. She seemed happy to hear her mother tongue, but her body language didn't budge. I read that signal loud and clear, so I kept my distance and sat down on the floor. "¿Cómo se llama?" I asked. "Julia." "¿Cuántos años tienes?" "How old are you?" "Cuatro," 4. She looked older than 4 to me. I had been told her parents were deported and she was left behind. She was under federal jurisdiction. I would find out later this was all misinformation. I signed some papers and said, "We'll see you on Monday." I asked Julia if she would come stay with me and my family for the weekend. She smiled. I told her I had 3 other kids. Her eyes expanded with excitement. On the drive home, she jolted my Spanish from its slumber. The social worker wasn't kidding about how much this little one talked. On April 6, 2018, U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced a new zero-tolerance policy in which the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice would partner for the sake of prosecuting illegal entry into the United States. Sessions said, quote, "If you cross this border unlawfully, then we will prosecute you. It's that simple. If you smuggle aliens across our border, then we will prosecute you. If you are smuggling a child, then we will prosecute you, and that child will be separated from you as required by law. If you don't like that, then don't smuggle children over our border," end quote. 6 weeks later, almost 2,000 children had been separated from their parents at the border since the zero-tolerance policy took effect. When Sessions announced the administration's new policy, I couldn't comprehend the cruelty. I also wondered if it explained why a preschooler was living under my roof. Julia had come to live with me and my family in February of 2018, and it felt surreal to be a part of her story. She had first been separated from her mother, Guadalupe, called by her nickname Lupe through the rest of this book, by smugglers who were paid to bring them across the border. Julia had then been separated from her stepfather, Carlos, by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, likely because what was recognized by the Honduran government as stepfather was not recognized by the U.S. government as the same, a detail I didn't understand until an immigration expert read the first draft of this book and explained it. Julia had already suffered much trauma, and separating her from her stepfather had only inflicted more. The weight of the trauma that we, as a nation, began inflicting on vulnerable children and their parents was cruel and unusual punishment. When I heard that my own country was going to begin separating children regularly from their parents as a policy, it broke me. Reality became surreal, and Andrew and I learned to live in it, separating the trauma from our emotions so that we could survive. As the veil of Oz is ever lifting from my white evangelical American eyes, what I now see is simply heartbreaking. Government-secured human rights are mostly for privileged white people. Julia is not white. Julia is undocumented. Julia's first language is Spanish. Julia is a girl. These are all labels that set her back in a society made by and for white, passport-holding, English-speaking males. But God, who is neither white nor male, despite my use of the pronoun he, shines his good news on every human being alike. The book is Separated by the Border by Gina Thomas. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Muggsy's rap sheet tweets, remember this 5th of November, the Ukrainian treason and plot. I know of no reason the Orange Man's treason should ever be forgot. And Muggsy notes, I rewatched V for Vendetta last night, an annual ritual, and it took on new significance this year. It's been years since I've seen that movie. Louise and I should watch that this weekend and see what's going on. So, anyhow, are you experiencing hate in your world, number one, and does it seem to be politically inspired? I sort of told the story of Louise and this woman on the airplane. She and this woman were talking about, what they found offensive about Trump, and this person behind them, leans forward and starts basically saying, how dare you talk about the president that way? That's wrong, quack, quack, quack. And I mean, they're just having a conversation on an airplane, right? And so, then this woman sitting next to Louise just shuts up, and Louise is like, she can't stop us from talking. We can talk. And the woman's like, no, I don't want to do it anymore. And she just shut down. End of conversation. Because she was intimidated by a maggot. Have you been intimidated by maggots? I mean, are you experiencing this? These people wearing maggot hats? Steve in Noblesville, Indiana. Hey, Steve, what's up?
Hey, Tom, I was at the grocery store yesterday, and this is funny. This old guy, I'm 72 years old, but this guy, he was older than me. He just blurts out, I got a hat that says, not my president, and he blurts out, you communist turd.
Yeah, right.
And I said, hey, I can have my opinion just like you. Well, you can't talk about the president like that.
Yeah.
And he was real loud. We were in line to check out, and he was just as loud as could be. And I told him, I said, everybody has their right to say what they want to say.
Yeah, which is true. I mean, if I saw somebody wearing a maggot hat, and I've seen a few. I wouldn't confront them. They have every right to say whatever they want on their hat, just like you, Steve, have a right to say, not my president on your hat.
Yeah, and he just blurted it out. My wife stepped in, which surprised me. She says, look, buddy, he can have his opinion just like you have yours. Yeah. Well, I love this president. And I said, so I don't.
Yeah. Yeah, I would bet just about anything, Steve, that guy is a Fox News watcher. But I obviously we don't know.
I figured he was.
Yeah, but it's really like it's become a cult over there. Steve, thanks a lot for the call. It's great to hear from you. Jeff in San Francisco, you wanted to talk about your favorite candidates for the Democratic primary and why, and kind of get more long form into this.
Well, I'm going for Bernie, and then he's going to pick Elizabeth as his running mate, and I'll call up the Bernie and Beth ticket. And they might even just flip a coin to see who's the leader.
Bernie and Beth, or Bess and Bernie?
Bernie and Beth.
Oh,
Elizabeth
Beth.
Warren.
Okay. Yeah,
Beth,
I've heard her called Liz a lot, but never Beth. But those are both B's, so I get what you're trying to say.
So basically, because of Medicare for all, and they're both want to write off our student loans, and it's going to save the family $3,000 a month. Yeah, right there.
Yeah, and
my premium.
Yeah, yep, and we can do this. I mean, we're already spending, $49 trillion a decade on healthcare, and but 20% of that's being skimmed off the top as profits and executive salaries and dividends. And if we simply go nonprofit, let the government run it, that cost goes from 20% down to 3%. And the same with college, making college affordable. Jeff, thank you very much for the call. It's great to hear from you. Lee in Tucson, Arizona. Hey, Lee, what's up?
Hi, yeah.
I wanted to say that I'm Bernie all the way. He's the only one that is a true progressive. He, unlike Warren, did not bring corporate money into his campaign at all, and won't. And he will stand for the people. And I really like to say that single payer is the only thing that's going to save us financially in this country. Yeah. And then you were talking about what's going on with the racism and stuff, and I think it's because capitalism has taken over the world and has changed our values and done away with our human values and replaced them with this desire for competition and to make the most money possible.
Yeah.
And what that's done is created bullies, these huge corporations that suck up all of the resources and leave the rest of us scrambling for the crumbs at the bottom. And so, of course, you have, when people are feeling like they're just not going to survive anymore because they can't make enough money, then, of course, that sets the stage for demagogues to come in and ramp up the fires for xenophobia and racism and all that stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I would say it's not specifically capitalism, but neoliberalism. It's this idea that capitalism can do things better than democracy can do them, even in the public square. And the idea that the Supreme Court put forward in the 1970s that capitalism and capitalists can basically control the public square. They can control government because their voices are so important and they have so much money, and that therefore their voices are important. That was the Buckley decision and some of these things. And yeah, spot on. Lee, thank you very much for the call. Good talking to you. Chaz in Lakewood, Washington. Hey, Chaz, what's up?
Na zdrovie, comrade. Is America great again, or what?
Здравствуйте. Yeah, what's up?
Yeah. Hey, listen, I wanted
welcome
to relate
to
a story.
Trumpistan.
Well, I didn't know if I should get away with that or not. I'm going to try to ease up on that.
Another beautiful
rhetoric.
day in Trumpistan. I think that's
my God,
the cheating chat.
Tom,
The
it's
greeting
been a long
Chaz.
time. Very kind of you to say so.
Indeed.
So here's the story: is that a friend of mine, a very close friend of mine, back from high school, was being menaced by some MAGAs in a pickup truck. This is like Sonoma County, close to Napa. And, he and his little niece did I mention he's Filipino, are just biking past a driveway, and some guys in their, out near their pickup are drinking some brews. And they mess with them. Hey, why don't you go back home? And they toss a couple of beer bottles, not intended to hit them, but to menace them a little bit. And my Filipino friend, knows better, and he just keeps on cycling past. Well, a couple minutes later, they kind of cross the center line a little bit to kind of mess with them a little bit. So Russ and his niece turn into a winery there, and then that pretty much was the end of it. But good thing they didn't carry it any further, because it turns out Russ is a second-degree black belt.
Oh, yeah, you messed with the wrong guy. Amazing story, amazing story. Chaz, thanks a lot. It's great to hear from you. I appreciate it. Belle in San Jose. Hey, Belle.
Hi there.
What's up?
Sorry. Hi. I actually had a story about the whole, just the Trump mania. I don't know what to call it.
This maggot phenomena. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was in a relationship for 9 years. Became a long distance. Moved away. He moved away, and I think just being away for a long time, he became very aggressive, very angry, and I also blame Fox News and, Facebook and everything. But we ended up breaking up just because of this presidency. And I credit I think of the brainwashing of my father.
Yeah, Jen Seiko's movie, yes. Which is
my goodness.
Which is out there. I think it's on Hulu and other places. You can easily find it and watch it. It's an amazing movie.
Oh yes. It hit so many points, and I told him about it, and no, that's just liberals, just always dismissing, and always when I would come back at him with facts, and no, that's just fake news, and it was just so it became ugly, and I thought, for my sanity, I'm going to get out of this. I don't want to fight, and I'm out. I tapped out.
That's so unfortunate. I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
But Belle,
but it's out there.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing your story with us.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Robert in Omaha, Nebraska. Hey, Robert. What's up?
Yes, I'd just like to say that I want to tell your audience that I will support Bernie.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because I want Medicare for all, and I would like for all the corruption in the United States to end, and let's get America back on track.
Yeah, that sounds like a plan. I'm totally in favor of that. Thank you, Robert. Dan in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. Hey, Dan, what's up? Thanks for listening to WRRD.
Not a whole lot. I enjoy the program frequently. I think this thing with Trump and making it okay, or at least giving people the idea that it's okay to discriminate against people, is not a new thing. You hear about these stories coming out of Wisconsin, and lots of the big towns here, especially Milwaukee, I think is the most segregated town or large city in the United States. And they continue to marginalize people, and this seems to have given them an excuse to do so.
So you think that's why the guy got acid thrown on him?
Absolutely. There's a lot of people here that are Sikh also, and they've been on ongoing increased racist acts against them because people think they're Muslim terrorists.
Right, when in fact they're
not.
They're Hindu, yeah. It's a subset of Hinduism.
Right. And they've been very helpful to the United States throughout history.
Yep.
It's just a complete ignorance for people to realize what facts are. And then just to do what people have been taught from little on. You don't have to agree with the people, but to respect people, that they should have a basic right to the pursuit of happiness just like everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah, and the Sikhs have been, good citizens all over the world. I mean, it's a really an extraordinary group of people. A friend of mine is a Sikh, and wow, what a commitment and kind of noble. I was going to say worldview, but that's not quite it. A value system, as it were. Dan, thanks a lot.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
Yep, thanks for the show.
Yep, good talking to you. So, hate on the agenda. By the way, I wanted to also talk about quid pro quo, this phrase, and I mentioned this briefly yesterday, but I want to get into it a little more. We'll talk about that and more as we roll along here with the program. Stick around. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
It is 46 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program, occupying the media 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, right here. And welcome back. Barbara in Berwyn, Illinois. Hey, Barbara, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's up?
Oh, hi. Thank you for taking the call. I'm coming in on the tail end of your poll.
Mm-hmm.
I'm for Bernie.
Okay.
And because he's the originator of this whole idea of running for president without corporate funding, or mostly without it.
Mm-hmm.
And he did well. He did so well that many of the centrist Democrats that are running have been imitating him. At least they were in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
He's had years of experience in the House and the Senate as a true progressive.
Mm-hmm.
And
he was the co-founder of the Congressional Progressive Caucus.
You want me to know?
No, I said Bernie was he was the co-founder of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. I mean, you talk about being a true progressive.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he's the guy who's like, burning it into the DNA of the Democratic Party and of Congress, in fact. It's pretty amazing.
Hey, I didn't know that. And the other thing is there's a poll out that says that Elizabeth Warren is mainly attracting the professional class and the educated.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Bernie is attracting everyone else.
Yeah,
reaching working
class
I think
people.
He has more chance of running.
Well, I think that's
winning. I mean,
yeah. Well, and also, I mean, Bernie. I was mentioning my show here, which not so much like we created Bernie, but the people who watch my show know Bernie really well, so a lot of them are going to like
him.
Yes,
I heard that.
But I think it goes beyond that. I think that Bernie also had an enormous amount of exposure 4 years ago when he ran for president, in the primary against Hillary Clinton. And so there's a familiarity with Bernie, particularly among working class people, and and he did a pretty good job of outreach to minorities as well. You know, kind of left over from 4 years ago, and then he's doing it again now. And that's a hill that Elizabeth Warren has not yet completely climbed. And so, you know, we'll see how that goes. But I get it. Thank you very much for the call. I appreciate it, Barbara. Good talking to you. Don in Milwaukee, Oregon. Hey, Don, what's up?
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Hartmann, for being who you are. And I'd like our president to be replaced because he inspires certain people to think they're beyond the law here in the homeland and
including
around
himself.
The world. And ideally, I would like Bernie to be there as president or vice president. Because of the stress of president, I'd like for him to at least be vice president. Any combination of him and Elizabeth Warren would help us to redefine our democratic operating system, which Thomas Jefferson suggested after they had written the Constitution. He forgot to put in. It's in his letters. Him and all the others agreed. We forgot to put something in there. They wanted it to be updated every 20 years for the current generations as the population expanded and evolution of our culture. I'm going to hang up and thank you, sir.
No, you're right, Don. I mean, Jefferson in one of his more famous letters said, you know, a man should, you know, expecting people to live by a constitution produced by previous generations is like expecting a man to wear the coat that he wore as a child, you know, or as a young man. You know,
I salute your efforts.
Yeah, thank you, Don.
Good luck, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. I appreciate it. And thanks for calling, and thanks for watching Free Speech TV. Jefferson absolutely, you know, believed that I think he said every 19 years, that was a generation back then, but that, you know, we should be revisiting things. We'll be right back. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Let's make this a public utility. I go through all the numbers and give you the whole rant in a new. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and Mohammed in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Hey, Mohammed, what's on your mind today?
How you doing, Tom?
Good. What's up?
This is my first time calling, but I'm a long-time listener. I just wanted to share some experience with you. I got kicked off the voter roll, right? And so I tried to. When I found out I was kicked off, I tried to reapply, re-register, right?
Yeah.
And so I went through all of the process, and when it got to the finalization, it wouldn't let me finalize it. And because
you're talking doing this online, Mohammed?
Yeah, I did it online. They put me down as I put down as Democratic, as a Democratic voter. I'm a Bernie-crat, okay?
Right.
But they wouldn't let me finalize it as a Democrat. So I said, okay, let me try something. So I put Republican in there. And now I'm registered to vote.
Whoa. So the online voter registration system in Louisiana said you can't register as a Democrat, but it'll let you register as a Republican? Seriously?
It will let me register as a Republican, but it won't let me register as a Democrat.
Oh, man. This is like how they program voting machines, and then you confront them about it, and they go, oh, well, it's got to be a little programming error there. It's incredible.
Yeah.
Mohammed, thanks a lot for sharing your experience with us. I appreciate it. Ken in Lafayette, Colorado. Hey, Ken, what's on your mind today?
Good morning, Tom. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I just want to comment earlier. You asked if people have experienced, more bigotry, racism since Trump. And I am a minority of color. Lived in Colorado all my life, big mountain biker. And last summer, I was out on the western slope of Colorado. I was in Grand Junction, Colorado, actually. But I was riding my bike to get some food. Bicycle, that is, and this pickup truck with some young kids, young people were in it, and a few people in the back, and they all flipped me off as they passed me, I passed them, right? And I'm on the way to the restaurant, and it's like, gee, that's really reassuring. And granted, they didn't verbalize anything, but one, being a minority of color, you stand out. And with Trump, these people are more emboldened, which is
that's my big question, Ken. Are you? I mean, there's also an ongoing war in some parts of the country between bicyclers, and automobile drivers, and so you don't know if it was that or race. But assuming your instincts are right, and your instincts are probably, you were the one who was there. Broadly speaking, have you noticed that the air has changed? The what's the old German word? Zeitgeist, the ghost of the times, the spirit of the times, has changed since Trump became president.
Yes, I do, and people, minors of color, can relate to this, and it's not always a verbal insult, if you will, but it's that hairy eyeball, if you will, that you get when you walk into an establishment. People kind of stop and just give you this glaring look, and it's like, hi, how are you doing? And they, and they shuffle off. And I read that article about the gentleman in Wisconsin yesterday, and very upsetting. Yeah. Very, very upsetting. And granted, even before Trump, being a minority of color, I've experienced this blatant, in my face, like, what are you doing here kind of stuff. But it just seems to have gotten, people are just more emboldened. And it's very disturbing. And it's a real thing. And I really attribute a lot of the increase to Trump.
Yeah. Yeah, I that's my sense of it too, Ken. But it's just a sense. I don't have the statistics. Ken, thank you for the call. Colleen in Long Island, New York. We just have a half a minute here, Colleen, till the end of the first hour. You wanted to talk about who you want to vote for.
Well, it's for Bernie, of course. Mm-hmm. I finally found a candidate that caught up with my mindset. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've always been a registered independent. And the reason was because I never really was heartened by the Democrats. Mm-hmm. But I will also say that the reason I found your show was because Trump was elected. Because I couldn't watch regular news.
So you found us on Free Speech TV.
Yes, I did, which I don't have access to now, but I have access to your show still.
Yeah, well, it's also on the internet at freespeech.org. So, although it's on Dish and Dish satellite system and DirecTV and Roku and Apple and there's just a bunch of different ways to get Free Speech TV. But that's great, Colleen. Thank you very much for the call and thanks for sharing your story with us. We'll be back. We've got a lot to cover here today. Stick around. We're going to get into the impeachment process and extortion.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study by Stefano Harney and Fred Moten. This is from the introduction. It starts with love, exchange, fellowship. It ends as it begins, in motion, in between various modes of being and belonging, and on the way to new economies of giving, taking, being with and for. And it ends with a ride in a Buick Skylark on a way to another place altogether. Surprising, perhaps, after we have engaged dispossession, debt, dislocation, and violence, but not surprising when you have understood that the projects of fugitive planning and black study are mostly about reaching out to find connection. They are about making common cause with the brokenness of being, a brokenness, I would venture to say, that is also blackness, that remains blackness, and will, despite all, remain broken, because this book is not a prescription for repair. If we do not seek to fix what has been broken, then what? How do we resolve to live with brokenness, with being broke, which is also what Moten and Harney called debt? Well, given that debt is sometimes a history of giving, at other times a history of taking, at all times a history of capitalism, and given that debt also signifies a promise of ownership but never delivers on that promise, we have to understand that debt is something that cannot be paid off. Debt, as Harney puts it, presumes a kind of individualized realization to a naturalized economy that is predicated upon exploitation. Can we have, he asks, another sense of what is owed that does not presume a nexus of activities like recognition and acknowledgement, payment and gratitude? Can debt become a principle of elaboration? Moten links economic debt to the brokenness of being in the interview with Stefan Shukatis, who he acknowledges that some debts should be paid and that much is owed, especially to black people, by white people. And yet he says, I also know that it is, that what it is that is supposed to be repaired is irreparable. It can't be repaired. The only thing we can do is tear this stuff down completely and build something new, end of quote. The Undercommons do not come to pay their debts, to repair what has been broken, to fix what has been undone. If you want to know what the Undercommons wants, what Moten and Harney want, what black people, indigenous people, queers, and poor people want, what we, the we who cohabit in the space of the Undercommons want, it is this. We cannot be satisfied with the recognition and acknowledgement generated by the very system that denies A, that anything was ever broken, and B, that we deserve to be the broken part. So we refuse to ask for recognition, and instead we want to take apart, dismantle, tear down that structure right now. That right now limits our ability to find each other, to see beyond it, and to access the places that we know live outside its walls. We cannot say what new structures will replace the ones we live with yet, because once we have torn stuff down, we will inevitably see more and see differently and feel a new sense of wanting and being and becoming. What we want after the break will be different from what we think we want before the break, and both are necessarily different from the desires that issue from being in the dark. Let's come at this by another path. In the melancholic and visionary 2009 film version of Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, 1963, Max, the small seeker who leaves his room, his home, his family to find the world beyond, finds a world of lost and lonely beasts, and they promptly make him their king. Max is the first king the wild things have had, whom they did not eat, and who did not, in turn, try to eat them. And the beasts are the first grown things that Max has met, who want his opinion, his judgment, and his rule. Max's power is that he is small while they are big. He promises the beasts that he has no plans to eat them, and that this is more than anyone has ever promised them. He promises them that he will find ways through and around and will slip through the cracks and re-crack the cracks if they fill up. He promises to keep sadness at bay and to make the world with the wild creatures that roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws. That Max fails to make the wild things happy or to save them or to make the world with them is less important than the fact that he found them and he recognized in them the end of something and potentially the path to an alternative in his world, or an alternative to his world, excuse me. The wild things were not the utopian creatures of fairy tales. They were the rejected and lost subjects of the world Max had left behind. And because he shuttles between the Oedipal land where his mother rules and the ruined world of the wild, he knows the parameters of the real. He sees what is included and what is left out. And he is now able to set sail for another place, a place that is neither the home he left nor the home to which he wants to return. Moten and Harney want to gesture to another place, a wild place that is not simply the leftover space that limbs real and regulated zones of polite society. Rather, it is a wild place that continuously produces its own unregulated wilderness. The zone we enter through Moten and Harney is ongoing and exists in the present, and as Harney puts it, some kind of demand is already being enacted, fulfilled in the call itself. While describing the riots of London in 2011, Harney suggests that the riots and insurrections do not separate out the request, the demand, and the call. Rather, they enact the one in the other. The book is The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study. There. The book is Homewreckers by Aaron Glantz.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back. On the line with us is Ben Ehrenreich, the journalist and contributor to The Nation magazine, author of The Way to the Spring, based on reporting from the West Bank, and a forthcoming book coming out next year, early next year, Desert Notebooks, a roadmap for the end of time. BenEhrenreich.net is his website, and Ben Ehrenreich is his Twitter handle. Ben, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Tom. It's great to be here.
So you're writing about PG&E and power belonging in the hands of the people, essentially. That you know, if we only have one power line coming into our house, that's a natural monopoly, and therefore that should not be in the hands of private for-profit corporations because it's just ripe for exploitation, among other things. Do I have that right?
That sounds about right. Yeah. I mean, I think this has been very clear for a very long time. And anyone who remembers, say, the name Aaron Brockovich will probably have some idea why, or who remembers the 2010 pipeline explosion in San Bruno, California, which killed 8 people and wiped out almost 30 homes. But I think the climate crisis has made it absolutely clear that having a private entity, which is beholden only to its investors, who are not people who necessarily live in California or care at all about people who live in California, but having them control essential public resources is a recipe for catastrophe. And that catastrophe isn't something that we have to guess at anymore. Right. Catastrophe is something we're living.
Yeah, it's not an abstraction. It's very real. You mentioned Erin Brockovich. I remember, this was like the 80s or 90s, wasn't it? When she outed some pollution crisis. Am I remembering correctly? I mean, this was refresh my memory, please.
She was a humble law clerk in the small town of Hinckley, California, a small town in the Mojave Desert, and started noticing that a lot of her neighbors were coming down with cancer. And she did some research and found out that PG&E had for years in the 1950s and 60s been dumping hexagonal chromium, wastewater laced with chromium-6 in unlined pools outside of Hinckley. And if you dump water in unlined pools, it seeps into the water system and into the aquifer.
Right.
So they had contaminated. It's a small desert town. They probably didn't think twice about it. And it took people's lives. It destroyed people's lives. And that contamination, this is that's well known. Aaron Brockovich was played by Julia Roberts.
That's right.
And this was a big movie. All of America got to hear about this one, and they still haven't cleaned it up. There's still
there's still hexavalent chromium in the water in Hinckley.
Yeah, if you pour water, if you pour wastewater into the water table, it spreads.
Yeah,
you get a plume that spreads for miles and miles.
Yeah.
I found a piece. I think it was in Vice that I linked to in the Nation article that was published a couple of years ago. That it's still a mess.
Still there. We're talking with Ben Ehrenreich, who writes for The Nation magazine, among other things. He's got a new book that'll be out early next year, Desert Notebooks, a roadmap for the end of time. Ben, I remember Enron. I remember when when all those audio tapes came out, and I think some of them came out from the Portland, Oregon office, in fact, which is where I am, of Enron, where they were talking about shutting down power. Shut down grandma. Shutting off power to people in California in order to create a perception of an electrical shortage crisis. That I think this might have been summer. They might have been trying to blame it on air conditioners or something. But the reality is that all they were trying to do was set up an excuse for an increase in rates, and which they succeeded in doing. But and also they wanted to hurt Gray Davis, who was the Democratic governor, because he wanted to regulate them, and they wanted to replace him with a Republican, which is exactly what happened. This took down Gray Davis, and you ended up with,
they recalled him and replaced him with Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah, exactly. And recall it was heavily funded in part by Enron, and then you ended up with Arnold Schwarzenegger. But then Enron imploded. How much of, you said PG&E was had been poisoning people since the 50s in California. Was PG&E? What was the relationship between PG&E and Enron, and how interconnected were Enron and PG&E in the California power systems?
Oh God, I write about climate. I'm hardly an expert on.
Okay, so that's not your area.
Utility politics. Okay. But I'll tell you, I do remember in those years I was living in Los Angeles and being up in San Francisco. At the height of that, and it was a real crisis. They were turning out the lights all over the state. You'd be in downtown San Francisco, and the lights were off in most of the government buildings. There was a kind of semi-apocalyptic feel to it. And then you go back to Los Angeles, and everything was fine. We didn't have any brownouts, we didn't have any blackouts, we didn't have our rates were completely unaffected as the rest of the state was dealing with these massive hikes in their electricity rates. And it was because LA has a municipal utility. We have the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, which is not anyone's idea of a utopian solution to energy delivery. I mean, it's not a particularly accountable institution. It has some pretty ugly chapters in its own history. But that said, it is wildly more efficient and wildly more accountable than these big private utilities like PG&E.
Right.
And that's true around the country and around the state. That Sacramento did not lose power while most of its neighbors did this last month, because Sacramento has municipal power, and their rates stay lower than PG&E's does.
A city-owned system. Yeah. So I understand about half of the electricity generated in the United States is generated by investor-owned, by private for-profit corporations, and about half of it is generated by municipal-owned or state-owned or county-owned utilities, or even larger than that, regional utilities like the TVA. Correct me if I'm wrong on that stat, first of all, but secondly, for people who live in an area that is, where the utility is a for-profit utility, who would like to see that utility be taken over by the local government or by the government, whatever government's appropriate. I mean, if it's a statewide utility, it would be the state government. If it's a citywide utility, it would be city government. What do people do, and what is happening in California right now to what's the word for deprivatize? It's not municipalized because this is statewide.
To take a public takeover. Yeah,
it's not nationalized. There's got to be a word for it. But anyhow, how do we do this?
In California, there's been some grassroots movement around Northern California. A group that I mentioned in the article has taken shape called Let's Own PG&E, which is pushing to take PG&E public. There've been some very prominent elected officials who've also been pushing for this. Ro Khanna, the Silicon Valley congressman, has come out in favor of taking PG&E public. So has the mayor of San Jose. So far, Gavin Newsom, the governor, has been a bit more disappointing on this, and at least as of a week and a half ago, was asking Berkshire Hathaway to make a bid on PG&E. PG&E is now in
other words, get more responsible stockholder ownership. Is that his?
Yeah, I mean that, and at least Warren Buffett, I suppose, gives money to Democrats, but but Berkshire Hathaway is makes a huge portion of its profits from fossil fuel extraction, from coal, from shale oil in the Permian Basin, and this is even our most benevolent fossil fuel executives are hardly looking out for our best interests.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, and I get with Gavin Newsom as the governor, he's also whether it's legal or whether it's just kind of symbolic, he's basically the head of the Democratic Party in California. And there's probably a lot of Democrats who are funded in part by utilities, and that's a problem inside the Democratic Party. Frankly, I saw Eric Garcetti over the weekend and spoke with him. I should have. I didn't bring this topic up though, and I looking back, I wish I had.
The mayor of LA. Gavin,
but he's got his own power company, so he's in Fat City, right?
Yeah, he's a little bit insulated from all of this, but both Gavin Newsom and Eric Garcetti have national political ambitions, and I think are more aligned with the more sort of careful centrist wing of the party that doesn't want people shouting the word socialist at them. Bernie Sanders, did. As part of his Green New Deal proposal, Sanders has called for taking all utilities public.
That's great. That's great. Ben Ehrenreich, journalist and contributor to The Nation magazine, author of The Way of Spring and a Roadmap, and Desert Notebooks. Ben, thanks for dropping by.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls after this at 16 and a half minutes past the hour. And welcome back. There we go. Tom in Aurora, Colorado. Hey, Tom, what's on your mind today?
Good morning, Tom.
Hey.
Hi. I was just going to let you know I'm a Bernie supporter. Saw your poll earlier. And I was just curious, if we have a fundamental problem in our voting system in terms of needing accountability, paper ballots, how does that argument get pushed forward where we can actually get these kind of essential basic changes made so we know our vote is correct?
Yeah. You're seeing, positive movement in the states that are controlled by Democrats. Here in Oregon, up in Washington State, we have these, I think we're the only two states in the union now that have 100% mail-in voting. And so every single ballot is a paper ballot that's been handwritten. Somebody called a couple of weeks ago and said, "Oh, gee, there's they got this new voting thing here where you do the electronic voting machine and it prints your ballot for you." And I thought that it was printing an actual ballot, that just looked identical to what they chose. But it turns out it's also got a little barcode on it, and what the thing is reading is apparently just the barcode. And so it's still a black box system. And as long as these voting companies are running these black box systems where we really don't know that our vote is being counted, and these voting machine companies are so heavily tied into the Republican Party, in some cases explicitly tied into the Republican Party, I think we've got a really serious problem, and it's something we need to face. Tom, thank you for the call. Michael in Fort Collins, Colorado. Hey, Michael, what's up?
Not much. How are you, Tom?
I am well. So
I'm a first-time caller.
Thank you.
And so I'm a little nervous, but I just wanted to bring up the ideas of Daniel Quinn and the books that he's written.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you've ever read any of his books. I'm sure you have.
I have read all of his books, and Dan and I have had many long conversations about his books. He's passed away now, but in fact, he's been on our show a few times.
Right. Okay. So then you're very familiar with this. My point is to get people to realize that you can change who's in charge, but without systematic change, the person who's in charge is going to have an uphill battle.
Right.
So he says in his book, Beyond Civilization, that vision is to culture what gravity is to matter, and I'm sure you understand what that means. And overall, his basic point is how Mother Culture is whispering in our ears about things that we've accepted as the norm and stuff like that, and things that get carried on, like the messages we relay to each other get carried on generation after generation, just like the genes in our body get carried on generation after generation.
Right.
Our bodies are just the vessels for all of this.
Yeah.
So without real change, I fear that even if Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or whoever, and any of them would be infinitely better than Donald Trump, I fear that it would be an uphill battle. And I really think that people need to understand that it's one thing to put in a progressive or a Democrat, but it's a completely another thing to actually institute systematic change, which is really what I think this country needs in general.
Yeah, I'm with you. And this is, and tragically, a lot of the problems that we have that are systemic were caused by the Supreme Court. Just coming out and saying, hey, we just decided corporations are people and entitled to rights under the Bill of Rights. Or, hey, we just decided that billionaires passing out money is constitutionally protected free speech. And now we're dealing with this crap. It's amazing. Michael, thank you for the call. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. All about this, what it means, where it could go, and what we can do about it. So check it out at thomhartmann.com. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. There's just a bunch of other stuff here in the news that I just wanted to share with you, and we can continue our conversations as we've been talking about. The mayor of Milwaukee is blaming Donald Trump now for this American citizen of Hispanic ancestry who had acid thrown on him by a 61-year-old white guy a couple of days ago, and told him to go back where he came from. He's an American citizen, right? So you've got that, number one. Number two, quid pro quo. This is, I think, a very substantial thing. I mean, this is the favorite phrase that the media is using right now, is quid pro quo. And Donald Trump is using it, and the Republicans are using it. And there's a reason why they're using it. Because it's Latin. It's not English. And they don't want to describe what Trump did in English. They want to describe it in Latin. And I'll bet if you walked up to, 30 or 40 random people on the street and stuck a microphone on their face and said, "What does quid pro quo mean?" They'd go, "I don't have a clue." Quid is Latin for this, and quo is Latin for that. And pro is one leads to another. In other words, for. Quid pro quo is Latin for this, for that. Now, why is that a bad thing? Well, actually, what we're talking about here is not quid pro quo, this for that. I mean, if you walk into a store and buy a candy bar and give the clerk $1 and he gives you your candy bar, that's quid pro quo, right? That's this for that. I gave you $1, I got my candy bar. No, what we're talking about is bribery and extortion. And there are specific laws against bribery and extortion. And in both bribery and extortion, what happens is somebody offers or receives or demands a thing of value in exchange for a particular behavior. Now, and they are doing it in a way that is, essentially inherently corrupt. The definition of extortion is, quote, threatened force, violence, or fear. Now, that's, what we typically think of with regard to criminal extortion. It's like the stuff the mob does, threatened force, violence, or fear, or under color of official right. This is the law. This is from the Hobbs Act, the law against extortion. And under a color of official right means using your official capacity as a government official to provide the quo, right, the thing that you're offering. But what do you want for this? Well, I want you to look into Joe Biden, or I want you to look into Burisma, or I want you to prove that Russia didn't hack the 2016 election. It was somebody in Ukraine. In fact, it was the Democratic Party running a server out of Ukraine that hacked themselves. This is literally the story that Sean Hannity has been peddling since 2016, and Trump has been peddling since he was elected. And it turns out that the guy who started this story in the United States and inside the Republican Party was Paul Manafort, who's in prison right now for tax evasion around the skeezy stuff that he was doing in Ukraine. But Democrats need to stop calling this quid pro quo. It's like, what the hell does that mean? That's why Trump loves that phrase. It's extortion and bribery. Bribery is basically, friendly extortion. Bribery is, hey, do this for me and I'll do this for you. And one of those thises is illegal. Withholding military aid that Congress has appropriated for another country, withholding that contingent on getting help in your own election, that's criminal. That's bribery. Threatening the other country by withholding it is also extortion. So let's start calling this what it is. It's bribery and extortion. Somebody, please tell the Democrats. That's just the beginning. We got a pile of news here, and we'll be getting to your calls as well as we continue through the day. And the transcripts. Now, new transcripts are being released. The transcripts that were released yesterday, we're discovering I'll get into this in a few minutes. Stick around.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And as we speak, the House of Representatives is releasing a new set of transcripts, which will show, I'm guessing, more perfidy from the Trump administration. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Defying Hitler by Sebastian Haffner, a memoir. This is from chapter 17, about a little more than a third of the way into the book. At first, the revolution only gave the impression of being an historical event like any other, a matter for the press that might just possibly have some effect on the public mood. The Nazis celebrate January 30th as their day of revolution. They are wrong. There was no revolution on January 30th, 1933, just a change of government. Hitler became chancellor, by no means the Führer of the Nazi regime. The cabinet contained only 2 Nazis apart from him. He swore an oath of allegiance to the Weimar Constitution. The general opinion was that it was not the Nazis who had won, but the bourgeois parties of the right, who had captured, in quotes, the Nazis and held all the key positions in the government. In constitutional terms, events had taken a much more conventional, unrevolutionary course than most of what had happened during the previous 6 months. Outwardly also, the day had no revolutionary aspects, unless one considers a Nazi torchlight procession through Wilhelmstrasse or a minor gunfight in the suburbs that night as signs of a revolution. For most of us outsiders, the experience of January 30th, 1933 was that of reading the papers and the emotions we felt while we were doing so. The morning headline was, "Hitler called to president." That produced a certain nervous, impotent irritation. Hitler had been called to the president in August and November. He had been offered the vice-chancellorship and then the chancellorship. Both times he had set impossible conditions, and both times there had been solemn declarations, "Never again." Each time, "never again" had lasted exactly 3 months. Hitler's opponents in Germany at that time suffered from a compulsive urge to offer him everything he wanted, indefatigably, and at an even cheaper price, indeed to press it upon him. It's the same now with his opponents outside Germany. Again and again, this appeasement was formally renounced, and again it gaily reappeared at the crucial moment. Just so today. Then, as now, one's only hope was Hitler's own unreasonableness. Would it not sooner or later exhaust the patience of his opponents? Then, as now, it became apparent that their patience knew no bounds. At midday, the headline said, "Hitler makes impossible demands." We nodded, half reassured. It was only too credible. It would have gone against his nature to ask for less than too much. Perhaps the cup had once more passed from us. Hitler, the last defense against Hitler. At about 5 o'clock, the evening papers arrived. Cabinet of National Unity formed Hitler Reichschancellor. I don't know what the general reaction was. For about a minute, mine was completely correct. Icy horror. Certainly this had been a possibility for a long time. You had to reckon with it. Nevertheless, it was so bizarre, so incredible to read it now in black and white. Hitler, Reichschancellor. For a moment, I physically sensed the man's odor of blood and filth, the nauseating approach of a man-eating animal, its foul, sharp claws in my face. Then I shook the sensation off, tried to smile, started to consider, and found many reasons for reassurance. That evening, I discussed the prospects of the new government with my father. We agreed it had a good chance of doing a lot of damage, but not much chance of surviving very long. A deeply reactionary government with Hitler as its mouthpiece. Apart from this, it did not really differ much from the 2 governments that had succeeded Brüning's. Even with the Nazis, it would not have a majority in the Reichstag. Of course, that could always be dissolved, but the government had a clear majority of the population against it, in particular the working class, which would probably go communist now that the Social Democrats had completely discredited themselves. One could prohibit the communists, but that would only make them more dangerous. In the meantime, the government would be likely to implement reactionary social and cultural measures with some anti-Semitic additions to please Hitler. That would not attract any of its opponents to its side. Foreign policy would probably be a matter of banging the table. There might be an attempt to rearm. That would automatically add the outside world to the 60% of the home population who were against the Hitler government. Besides, who were the people who had suddenly started voting Nazi in the last 3 years? Misguided ignoramuses, for the most part, victims of propaganda, a fluctuating mass that would fall apart at the first disappointment. No, all things considered, this government was not a cause for alarm. The only question was what would come after it. It was possible that they would drive the country to civil war. The communists were capable of going on the attack before a prohibition against them came into force. The next day, this turned out to be the general opinion of the intelligent press. It is curious how plausible an argument it is, even today, when we know what came next. How could things turn out so completely different? Perhaps it was just because we were all so certain that they could not do so, and relied on that with far too much confidence. So we neglected to consider that it might, if worse came to worse, be necessary to prevent the disaster from happening. Through the whole of February 1933, everything that happened remained a matter for the press. In other words, it took place in an arena that would lose all reality for 99% of the population the moment there were no newspapers. Admittedly, enough occurred in that arena. The Reichstag was dissolved. Then, in a flagrant breach of the Constitution, Hindenburg also dissolved the Prussian regional parliament. There were fast and furious changes of personnel in the civil service. The book defined Hitler. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Now, there are remedies for this. There are numerous solutions for this, but we really first have to understand how much damage, real damage, this is doing to the United States of America. It's all over that video over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. So Rand Paul is out there. This is the new shtick. Trump should be able to confront his accuser. In other words, the whistleblower. What they're trying to do, what Rand Paul, and Rand Paul is wrong, right? The Sixth Amendment says you can confront your accusers in a court of law. It doesn't say that you could just walk up to somebody who says you committed a crime. If somebody calls 911 and says, my neighbor just shot somebody in his front yard, you're not you might be a witness, but, once the crime is clear, once it's been discovered, it's not, the whistleblower is out of the picture. But what I think is going on here is Rand Paul and Donald Trump are trying to intimidate other whistleblowers in government. What they're saying to people at the EPA, what they're saying to people at the Department of Interior, what they're saying to people at the Internal Revenue Service, and by the way, there was a whistleblower at the IRS. We're still not hearing anything about that has to do with Trump's taxes. What they're saying to people at the Department of Treasury, what they're saying to people at the Federal Communications Commission and the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Elections Commission, what they're saying to government employees in all of these administration run departments is, if you tell the truth about what the Trump administration is up to, we are going to destroy your life. We're going to out you publicly. You're going to get the Christine Blasey Ford treatment where you get death threats and you have to move 2 or 3 times and you have to delete all your social media and your life gets turned upside down and you may even get shot or beat up or have terrible things happen to you. That's what they're saying. And the fact that Fox News and right-wing hate radio is participating in this is particularly despicable. And the fact that CNN and MSNBC aren't calling it out for what it is, which is witness tampering and intimidation, is despicable. But that's what's going on. And it's going on in a big way, by the way. We talked about quid pro quos. There's a few other things here in the news that I wanted to get. Actually, there's a bunch of other things in the news, from the New York Times to this is amazing. Republicans have been busted paying a for-profit company that does telemarketing and stuff like that. They paid them to jam the phone lines of House Democrats. 11,000 phone calls over the course of a week or two to 36 House Democrats to shut down their phones and to yell at them about impeachment. This is the Republican Party This was described, there was a dinner, it was an off-the-record Republican dinner with advisors and elected officials. In fact, it was called the off-the-record dinner. And this, from the New York Times, 2 people briefed on the effort said, quote, the Republican National Committee paid to generate thousands of calls to the congressional offices of nearly 36 House Democrats in recent weeks, an effort that was aimed at both shaping opinion around the impeachment inquiry and tying up the phones of the elected officials. I mean, this is how absolutely bizarre it is. And what are these guys doing in office? What are the maggots doing in office? The Trumpsters? Well, one of the head maggots, Andrew Wheeler, he's the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. Prior to that, he was either an oil or coal lobbyist. I mix him and the guy who runs the Interior Department up. One was a coal lobbyist and the other was an oil lobbyist. But now he runs the EPA. And yesterday afternoon, they announced that they are going to change the rules that have to do with how coal-fired power plants deal with the pollution they produce. Coal-fired power plants produce this stuff called fly ash, which is the waste from burned coal, which is really, really high in heavy metals. Everything literally from uranium. Coal ash is mildly radioactive. Everything from uranium to strontium to arsenic to lead to selenium and other heavy metals that cause cancer, cause neurological diseases, mercury, things like that. It's all in there, right? And coal plants are one of the top sources of this in the United States. And the prior regulations, EPA regulations, had given these coal companies up until the next couple of years to get their act together. Trump now has extended the deadline for power plants to 2028, actually the end of 2028, 2029, exempted a whole bunch of coal plants altogether. The EPA estimates that this move will save the coal-powered electric industry $175 million a year and will result in more than 100 million pounds of extra pollution every year. Trumpster, Mr. Wheeler, the chairman of the EPA, said these proposal revisions support the Trump administration's commitment to responsible, reasonable regulations by taking a common sense approach, which also protects public health and the environment. Right. The guy who is the director of the same EPA's Office of Environmental Justice under the Obama administration, his name is Mustafa Santiago Ali. He said, and I quote, the rule announced today puts millions of people's drinking water in jeopardy. I mean, this rule that they are undoing, according to back when the Obama administration, when President Obama was in office, this from the New York Times today, from the New York Times. I'll just quote the sentence. I'll just read you the sentence. The Obama administration estimated the regulations would stop about 1.4 billion pounds of toxic metals and other pollutants from pouring into rivers and streams. And I had this guy call yesterday. Remember, he called up and he says, I said, what's up? And he was like, oh, I love the fact that Donald Trump is creating jobs by doing away with regulations. And I'm like, how does that work? Right? I mean, if coal-fired power plants have to clean up their act and can't dump this waste in the rivers, they've got to hire somebody to do that. Somebody's got to design some kind of equipment that will filter those poisons out. Somebody else has to design some sort of a system to aggregate those poisons and turn them into something that's not going to get into the environment. Turn them into briquettes or something. I don't know however, or burn them at high temperatures or whatever you do with this toxic stuff. But those are jobs. When you do away with the regulation, all you need is to cut a little narrow path in the dirt between your coal ash pond and the local river and just let it pour into the river. I mean, how many jobs does that create? Regulations actually create jobs. Deregulation actually causes people to lose their jobs. Please, somebody tell these maggots who are watching Fox News and listening to Right Wing Hate Radio and are just completely clueless. Anyhow, we've been talking about a lot of things today. We were also talking about the hate that seems to be being brought on by Donald Trump. I'm curious your experiences on that. Ruth in the San Bernardino Mountains in California. Hey, Ruth, you have some thoughts on this?
Oh, yeah, I have some thoughts on this. The problem is that Trump supporters are not abstract to me. They are my neighbors, my fellow churchgoers, my friends, people I have known for over a decade. And I thought of these people as intelligent, reasonable, and compassionate. But because of their support of Trump, the more time has gone by and the more atrocities that Trump has committed, I have had to speak up. I can't stand by and say nothing when this evil is being done.
Right.
And as a result, I've been ostracized from my community. My pastor has called me a liar and banned me from our church, from even like our group texts, because I was trying to text, like the truth. And, it's just,
What was the
overwhelms
specific
me.
truth you were
I'm
trying to
sad.
text, Ruth?
Just like even wanted something from you. I would text so that people could see the truth, what was going on, or at least see the other side. But these people, they just so stubbornly just believe one thing. And for me, it'd be so easy if these smart people that I knew and had respected and thought were intelligent. That's what I can't wrap my head around. Is how can they not?
When Milton Mayer went to Germany in right after World War II and spent a year there living with and getting to know 10 Germans who lived and worked throughout the 7-year reign of Nazism in Germany, or maybe it was a little more than 7 years, but. And that was one of the questions that he kept asking them was, how could people have gotten into this cult, and how could you have gone along with it or at least understood it? None of these 10 people were Nazis or enthusiastic Nazis. They just kind of kept their heads down and did their jobs through this whole thing, right? College professor, a bricklayer, a baker, stuff like that. And one of the things that they all seemed to say, and you can read this in his book, They Thought They Were Free. One of the things that they all seemed to say was that, it was a madness, it was a cult, it was a belief system that their friends and neighbors fell into, and was very, very seductive, and and made great promises. And Hitler's whole thing was 1,000 years of peace. That was the Reich. That was the whole Third Reich was going to last for 1,000 years and bring peace to the entire planet, united under this one man, Adolf Hitler. And many Germans believed it. And I not to equate Trump to Hitler, because Trump is nowhere near as smart as Hitler was, but and frankly, I don't think he's as evil. Hitler was genuinely evil. I think Trump is just a small-time crook. He's just a pathetic narcissist. But this cult that has formed around him and the media support that this cult has. And all these people who are just seeing Trump as their meal ticket. It's astonishing. And yes, we have friends, we have neighbors who have fallen into the Trump cult. And you either agree to not discuss politics with them and continue the relationship, or you end up breaking up. It's really tragic. Ruth, thank you for the call and sharing your story with us. We'll be right back. It's 46 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be back with more of your calls in just a moment. Stick around. And welcome back. Let's see here, Vicki in Woodinville, Washington. Hey, Vicki, what's on your mind today?
I want to make a comment about PG&E.
Okay.
It was expressed with your guest, and I want to emphasize it in that I was talking to a friend, and I said, with all this experience people are having with a company that's run by PG&E, surely we're finally going to overtake this privatization and have it be run by the government and the state, so we can have it benefit the citizens instead of the shareholders.
Yeah.
And so she said, no, I don't think that's where the problem lies. She says they're not only paying off their shareholders before they go ahead and take care of the company itself and the people servicing it, the people that...
Right, before they trim the trees, yeah.
Right. But they're spending billions of dollars employing lobbyists that have bought off our legislature, and that's why they continue to stay in business, even though we have decades of evidence that they have really done a terrible job.
Yeah, and this is something that the Supreme Court legalized in a big way back in the 70s, and corporations have found, and in fact, it's amazing. I mean, there's literally articles about this in Business Week and The Economist and Forbes and Fortune. Corporations have found that they can invest $1 million in a new piece of machinery and maybe over a 10-year period make $10 or $20 million from that investment. But if they invest $1 million in buying a half a dozen politicians, they can make $1 billion in return. I mean, the returns are an order of magnitude greater in buying politicians than they are in buying new equipment, which is really, really a tragic commentary on the state of our politics and an indictment, frankly, of our Supreme Court. It's one of the things that caused me to write this new book about the Supreme Court, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court, and the betrayal of America, because they have betrayed the United States. And this was not, Congress, this was not presidents, this was, right-wing ideologues on the Supreme Court, Vicki, that brought this about.
Exactly, that's the point. And so it's never going to change until we change the laws. Therefore, we have to change the people on the Supreme Court so we can change the laws and then have the laws that are there enforced. I agree. And frankly, I think we also need to pass a constitutional amendment. This is, when Pete Buttigieg first kicked off his campaign back in the day, one of the things he said was going to be a cornerstone of his campaign was a constitutional amendment to say corporations aren't people and money is not speech. And that got me really enthusiastic and really excited. But I haven't heard him say it again. I don't know if that's still his position. He was also at one point in favor of single-payer health care and in fact tweeted out, I, Pete Buttigieg, say here, now, and forever, I support single-payer health care, and then he kind of backed away from that. So we'll find out. But just the fact that quote, moderate Democratic candidates acknowledge this problem of this system that they're all entangled in is, I think, a good thing. And, hopefully more and more people will, and we can take on the Supreme Court, and we can take on these structural, institutional problems, and then we can, clean up politics. But first, you've got to clean up the environment within which politics works, what Trump refers to as the swamp, although he's, just trying to replace it with more alligators. Vicki, thank you for the call, and thanks for listening to KBCS. We'll be right back. It's 51 minutes past the hour. Every day here on the Thom Hartmann Program, Louise and I and our team, Sean, Nate, Shira, Dave, Chase, Sue, Nigel, Ron, we all work to put together the very, very best show we possibly can. And there's an enormous amount of work that goes into the show. And one of the things that comes out of that is a lot of content, a lot of specific information that we go through and we dig out and, we want to share with you. And Sue puts that into our newsletter every week. And I think you will, if you don't already receive our newsletter, it comes in email every day, about an hour after we're off the air, or maybe a couple hours after we're off the air. And Sue goes through and pulls literally every link to every story that we talked about and puts it into the newsletter. It's free. We don't sell a list or anything. You complete safety and security. There's no charge. There's no nothing. Just, plug in your email address over at thomhartmann.com. And you get signed up for the newsletter. It's all fairly obvious. You'll see it on the website. So check it out, thomhartmann.com. Thank you. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Let's pick up some of your phone calls here. Some folks have been on hold for a while, and I want to... Robin in Kingston, Washington. Hey, Robin, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Just tying a few points you've been making together today, starting off with the violence. I actually see a symmetry of provocation between the ramping up of violence and, believe it or not, impeachment, articles of impeachment. Short thing. In 2015, being in the street all the time, I noticed white men getting together, more and more anger, more everything. I called in 2016, the summer, and was the person that said that Trump was going to win because of this. I'm also the person that is saying stop arguing with Trumpsters because of the events and the stories that you're hearing today, and that's sort of the way it should go. And like David K. Johnson says, this Trumpism is worse than you think. It's a very good time to vote by mail, okay?
Yeah.
Stop arguing with these people. Tying that into the formal articles of impeachment, I believe that Trump has totally been provoking. The Trumpsters are provoking us to do our worst, to bring out our bad side, to touch not the goodness, but some of the uglier things within. And since the middle ground of the country politically does not support impeachment, and obviously the Democrats like myself, or not like myself because I don't support that, but Democrats are like 80% to impeach, Republicans are 80% don't impeach. The middle ground is not decided and not solid enough, and I think Pelosi knows this. And so my position is don't take the provocation and think very, very carefully before you file formal articles of impeachment. I think Pelosi knows this.
We've got to have public hearings, Robin. I mean, this is what we learned from the Nixon impeachment. This is what came out of the Clinton impeachment. Is you have to have public hearings. Jacqueline in Seattle. Hey, Jacqueline, your thoughts?
Hey, yes. I was recently in Spain. Just came back last week, and I walked the Camino de Santiago Trail in the northern Basque Country. Yes, and
it's a beautiful country, isn't it?
Oh yes, I enjoyed it. Especially because I was not in this country.
Yeah.
There was no hate there. People actually helped each other, and even though we had a hard time communicating, we took the time to help each other and get us through to the next town. Anyway, the people I came across from France, from England, from Australia, nobody was in support of our president.
Yeah.
How it has not just impacted our country, but the world.
So your experience hanging out for a week and walking that trail in northern Spain and meeting all these people from all over the world who are all, appalled by Trump or just don't care or what? What's the general, how would you describe their reaction to Trump?
First, they can't believe that we elected a person like that.
Yeah.
And the highest power in this country. And how it has affected the entire world.
Yeah, it really
interactions with other countries.
Yeah, it really and truly is, extraordinary what has happened. It really is, and you didn't find literally even one person who is supportive of Donald Trump. I know Spain has they're having a problem right now where the people in the it's over on the other side of the country, the Catalan, the Castilians, is that what you call them? People in Barcelona principally who want to separate from Spain.
Right. Yes, and I was not near that area.
Yeah.
But no, not one supporter of Trump. And
That's
the people from England I talked to, they didn't understand why they had to go down that road to Brexit. It's going to have such a horrible financial impact on that country.
Yeah. Well, time will tell, but it looks like maybe it was the same billionaires who were promoting both of them. Jacqueline, thanks for sharing your story with us. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
It's fascinating. I should have asked if you got to Mondragon, which was just an amazing place. Louise and I were there some years back. I wrote a chapter about it for my book, Threshold, the world's largest co-op, employee-owned co-op. We'll be right back. Stick around. It's the top of the hour.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Fred Kaplan's new book, The Bomb: Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War. This is from the introduction. For 30 years after the Cold War ended, almost no one thought, much less worried, about nuclear war. Now, almost everyone is fearful. But the fear takes the form of a vaguely paralyzed anxiety. Because of the long reprieve from the bomb's shadow, few people know how to grasp its dimensions. They've forgotten, if they ever knew. The holiday from history began on August 8, 2017, when President Donald Trump, barely 6 months in office, told reporters at his golf resort in Bedminster, New Jersey, that if the North Koreans kept threatening the United States with harsh rhetoric and missile tests, quote, they will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen, end quote. Even those who didn't remember President Harry Truman's similar description 72 years earlier of the atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, Truman said, a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. It was clear that in language more bellicose than any president since the end of World War II, Trump was talking about launching nuclear weapons at North Korea. Not if its leader, Kim Jong-un, first attacked the United States, but merely if he developed the ability to do so. Then, 6 months later, Trump signed and released his administration's Nuclear Posture Review, a 74-page document that called for building new types of nuclear weapons and integrating them with the military's conventional war plans. In short, for treating nuclear weapons as normal. The red lights flashed. The alarm bells rang furiously. Yet here is what few recognized. None of these notions were new. The president himself seemed a departure from the norm. His character, erratic, eruptive, thin-skinned, willfully uninformed, a combustive mix for a world leader with his finger on the button. But the button and everything around it were the same. In those decades when most of us chose to forget the bomb, as global tensions calmed and fallout shelters crumbled and we turned our gaze to other problems and pleasures, the nuclear war machine continued to rumble forth in the beyond top-secret chambers of the Pentagon, the Strategic Command Headquarters in Omaha, the weapons labs in various parts of the country, and the think tanks whose denizens never stopped thinking about the unthinkable. They all kept at their singular task, wrestling with the dilemmas posed by the bomb's existence. How to deter nuclear war? How to fight a nuclear war if it cannot be deterred? How to win it, if such a thing is even possible? This is the nature of the nuclear era, and the era never drifted into suspension, even if our attention did. Trump snapped us out of our slumber, reminded those of us who were old enough to know, and informed those who weren't, that the bomb is still here. In public over the years, officers and officials have described America's nuclear policy as a second strike deterrence. If an enemy strikes us with nuclear weapons, we will retaliate in kind. This retaliatory power is what deters the enemy from attacking us. In reality, though, American policy has always been to strike first preemptively, or in response to a conventional invasion of Allied territory, or to a biological or large-scale cyber attack. In any case, not just as an answer to nuclear attack. All of these options envision firing nuclear weapons at military targets for military ends. They envision the bomb as a weapon of war writ large. This vision has been enshrined in the American military's doctrines, drills, and exercises from the onset of the nuclear era through all its phases. Most presidents have been skeptical of this vision, morally, strategically, practically, but none of them have rejected it. Some have threatened to launch nuclear weapons first as a way of settling a crisis. The few who considered adopting a no first use policy, in the end, decided against it. There are rationales for these doctrines, drills, and exercises, and for the retention of the first use option. They are driven by policies, personalities, and bureaucratic rivalries, but also by a logic which, once its premises are accepted, hurls its adherents and the rest of us into a rabbit hole of increasingly bizarre scenarios that seem increasingly, if strangely, rational the deeper they're probed. Understanding the nuclear era, the era of our lifetime, means understanding the rabbit hole, who dug it, and how we got stuck inside. It means tracing the maze of its tunnels, which is to say the arc of its history. A story enmeshed in secrecy, some of it still secret, much of it now illuminated by declassified documents and interviews with key actors, though never fully told. How did we get to this second coming of nuclear panic? How did we wind up with thousands of nuclear weapons, far more than any war aims could justify? What propelled the nuclear arms race during the decades-long Cold War? And what happened to the weapons and their guardians after the Cold War ended? And how and why did any of this persist? Chapter 1, Killing a Nation. The book Fred Kaplan's The Bomb. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Fight back or suffer defeat. Not everyone views Russia as offensive-minded, however. A smaller and less popular school of thought sees Russia under Putin as a weak and declining power. The book, The Russia Trap.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. You know, I have been talking for years, I mean, literally all 16 years that I've been doing this show, about the crisis in manufacturing in the United States. And, you know, when we first started the show, it was a process that was still evolving, although it was largely set in stone by the mid to late 1990s. And that was this neoliberal so-called free trade policy that Ronald Reagan started promoting back in 1980. And he and his advisors and his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, came up with this treaty between Canada and Mexico and the United States called NAFTA. That treaty was written by the, at least our part of it, written by the Reagan administration, fine-tuned during the first Bush administration. Reagan was not able to get that thing. They didn't get it done. They didn't get it out. And George Herbert Walker Bush did. His administration, put this together, and during Reagan's administration, it had been, let's open the world to China. Let's the free trade is going to save everything. And there's actually an ideology behind this, and this is the essence of neoliberalism, the new liberalism, and that, which is what neoliberalism means. And the word liberal there is used in the European context, in the British context, well, all of Europe, that. Liberal means, and Australia as well, that liberal means people who are in favor of the marketplace running things rather than the government running things, essentially. In Europe, what they call liberal, here in the United States, we call libertarian. So this neoliberal policy that came into being in the 1980s as corporate money and billionaire resources just poured into the Reagan administration in the 1980s as a result of the Supreme Court in 76 and 78 blowing up, taking off the books laws that regulated money and politics. As a result of that, this idea that a marketplace is better than a democracy, or that a marketplace is its own democracy, not only took hold of the Republican Party and the Reagan followers, but took hold of the entire United States. I mean, back in the 80s, I remember hearing these kinds of ideas being promoted on National Public Radio. They were being promoted and discussed by people across the political spectrum. And basically, here is the argument. If you want to know what's best for the country, if you want the best things to happen for the country, then, you know, you need basically a consensus. You need a vote. And you need a mechanism to make it happen. Well, if the vote happens every 2 years or every 4 years, that's awful slow, right, to elect your representatives. And then the representatives themselves have to go through this long process to write legislation, and question expert witnesses, figure out how things should be done, and then it goes through the legislative process. It gets made into law, and the law doesn't become into effect until the following year, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's just all slow and cumbersome and doesn't always get things right. And there's some truth to that. Actually, it was designed to be that way to some extent, because you don't necessarily want major decisions about how the economy runs or how your country runs or who we are as a people to be made, super fast and without a lot of thought and consideration. So what the Milton Friedman crowd, the neoliberal crowd, the libertarian crowd says, the Chicago school crowd, what they said was, well, there's another place where that voting is happening. And that place is the marketplace. And in the marketplace, there's literally 1 billion decisions a second being made in the United States. Every time somebody walks into a store and decides to buy a Snickers bar instead of a Hershey bar, that's a decision. That's a vote. Every time somebody walks into a clothing store and just decides to buy, Columbia sportswear rather than Cliff's Edge or whatever it is, that's a vote. And that the marketplace is aggregating this data so rapidly, and there's so many hundreds of billions of essentially votes being made every day within the context of the economy and the marketplace, that there's a hive wisdom there. There's a collective wisdom there. And in fact, there's some truth to that. This is how good products, theoretically anyway, rise to the top and bad products fall away and get replaced. And sometimes those cycles happen, within a matter of months. And so, one company is up one day and then it's down the next day, and, whose products. And now, of course, that kind of naively ignores the power of advertising, and it very naively ignores the power of monopoly power, of Facebook buying basically every potential competitor that comes along and incorporating it into their product, whether it's their messaging app or whether it's Instagram or whatever it may be. That whole theory ignores monopoly, and and therefore monopoly market power. Try being Apple's competitor right now, or Microsoft's competitor. I mean, they're so well established, they're so well entrenched, or Google's or Facebook's for that matter. So it ignores that, but it does make a certain amount of sense to a lot of people. And so what happened between 1981 and today, and it's still going, was that the Republican Party and about half the Democratic Party threw in with this position that the neoliberals were promoting, from von Mises to Milton Friedman. I mean, really, he's the most famous American who was involved in this stuff. Friedrich Hayek, it was called the Austrian School before it was called neoliberalism, before it was called the Chicago School. And, what they're asserting basically is that billionaires know best, the marketplace knows best, we should be listening to the richest among us and all this kind of stuff. And that free trade all around the world, that if all countries trade with each other, their interests will align because they are trading with each other. And that alignment of interests, in other words, keeping their own economies going, that alignment of interests will prevent war. I mean, this argument started out as kind of this actually is democracy. That was the initial argument of the wisdom of the marketplace. And then the wisdom of the international marketplace was marketed by people like Francis Fukuyama back in 1999 with, I think it was, the title of his book was The End of History and the Last Man, or something very close to that. And you know, a number of these, and by the way, Fukuyama has since renounced his embrace of neoliberalism. But there were a number of these neoconservative and neoliberal thinkers who were writing books and writing these deep tomes and thinking about this and you know, basically making this assertion. And then there were others of us, and I'm in this crowd, and Bernie Sanders was in this crowd and was on this program for 11 years, who are saying, wait a minute, there is a place for nationalism. Not toxic nationalism, not like Nazi nationalism, but where the country makes decisions that are the best thing for the country as their first priority. And therefore, these trade deals that are the best thing for the big corporations, but not necessarily the best thing for the country, need to be carefully scrutinized. And in fact, we should keep in place a tariff-based trade system, or we should be looking at something like most European countries and most Asian countries are doing now of, you know, a VAT tax, a value-added tax, which serves functionally as a tariff that discourages imports of cheap competition from overseas and encourages export of manufactured products from your own country. But we have not embraced that. And then Trump came along and basically took the words right out of Sherrod Brown's mouth. I mean, Sherrod Brown, the Democratic senator from Ohio, one of the most outspoken and articulate proponents, people in favor of a semi-protectionist trade policy. And Trump was like, you know, we're gonna use tariffs and we're gonna stop this, which, by the way, is the right thing to do. He just did it wrong. He's doing it by executive order. He's doing it by declaring a state of emergency. And, you know, that is not going to last beyond his presidency. So no company is going to build a factory based on Donald Trump's tariffs. Whereas if he had worked with Congress and gotten our trade laws changed and gotten those tariffs put into place permanently, then companies would be bringing the jobs home. But Trump doesn't know how to do things. But here is where this is leading us, or this is where this has led us. This is from the Financial Times today. Peter Spiegel and Andrew Edgecliffe Johnson writing from New York. And I'll just read you a few sentences of it. The U.S. Secretary of the Navy has warned that the, quote, fragile American supply chain for military warships means the Pentagon is at risk of having to rely on adversaries such as Russia and China for critical components. Richard Spencer, the U.S. Navy's top civilian, I'm sorry, it's not the Secretary of the Navy, it's the U.S. Navy Secretary. The U.S. Navy's top civilian told the Financial Times he had ordered a review this year of the contractors. What he's concerned about is certain high-tech and high-precision parts that we just don't make here in the United States anymore. And we're having to buy from China or Russia or from countries that are aligned with those countries, particularly China. He says he's particularly concerned about China. Again, quoting from the article, Mr. Spencer's efforts to improve the domestic supply chain have been hampered by repeated government shutdowns and haphazard federal budgeting in recent years. In other words, the incompetence of the Trump administration. This has undermined his ability to convince domestic suppliers that there will be a steady stream of business for them if they invest in building out their manufacturing capabilities, which is what I was just saying. You can't go to a company. He says, right now we're sliding back into a temporary budget extension, which I think is a bloody shame. And, you know, he's basically going to these companies and saying, you know, I really need you to make these parts that we're buying right now from China or from countries that are aligned with China or companies. One of the examples in the story is a company in Italy that is now aligning itself with China. They're taking Chinese money, and it's part of the whole Belt and Road thing. And this company is making stuff that is absolutely critical to American warships working. And he's like, we can't have this. It needs to be made in the United States. But no factory in the United States wants to make it because, you know, Trump's tariffs will probably go away when Trump goes away. And there's no, you know, there's no guarantee that you're going to have a customer 2 years down the road when you know, the government is coming to you and saying, would you please invest $50 million in building a factory? We need a rational trade policy. We need to repudiate neoliberalism. We need to reject this whole Reaganista experiment and return to what was working for us in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We need to actually and genuinely bring our jobs back home and establish, and reinforce our national security in the process. And welcome back. Liz in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Watch us on Free Speech TV. Hey, Liz, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom. First of all, I want to thank you and your staff for just being there. You're really
welcome, Liz.
Yeah, you enlarge our lives. But my husband and I down here, first of all, we're going to vote blue no matter who.
Yeah. Amen.
But Bernie Sanders is up there in our thoughts. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to talk about, you were talking about the hate issue. Mm-hmm. We live not too far from El Paso. Mm-hmm. And that was pretty scary what happened over there.
Yeah.
And I know that I grew up in New England, and I've always wrapped a scarf around my head in the winter to keep warm. And now I'm afraid to do that because I'm afraid people might think I'm Muslim.
And assault you.
It kind of stinks to be so paranoid, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it really does.
Anyway,
I share your concern, Liz. I think that hate is an emotion. It's fairly easy to stir up in people because it's part of our fight or flight response. It's wired into us as a survival thing.
Oh,
And Trump is playing us like a fiddle, and Fox News and right-wing hate radio. I mean, it's just absolutely breathtaking what's going on.
No, I agree with you on that.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to, I don't know if you saw the footage of the transit worker in San Francisco who grabbed the drunk guy who fell in front of a BART. He fell down into the transit.
Right, yeah, on the tracks.
BART transit in San Francisco runs on these tracks.
Right.
And he fell down and he would have been killed. But this guy reacted really quickly. And what he said is, well, that's what we got to do for each other, you know.
Right.
We're all human beings. We got to take care of each other.
Yep.
And that's what I believe.
Yeah, and we have to constantly remind ourselves of that when mother culture, as Dan Quinn used to call it, whispers in our ear, oh, look at that person. He's different from you. He's probably not as good as you. I mean, this story, or he's somebody that you should dislike or whatever. These things come out of our culture, and they're constantly, being whispered to us by not just our culture around us, but also our little internal voices. And we need to push back on that. We need to recognize it, and we need to say, wait a minute, I'm not going to go down that road.
Right, we got to rise above it and be better than that.
There you go. Yeah. Amen. Liz, thank you very much
for
the call.
Thanks for being there, Tom.
Yep, you're welcome. Good talking to you. Richard in Rio Rico, Arizona. Hey, Richard, what's on your mind today?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for your continuing education. I just wanted to reiterate that this is nothing new in this society. I got out of the Army in 1976, went to work for the railroads, manly, masculine job. I'm telling you, I've heard every racist comment. I married a Mexican girl from El Paso, Texas, and I'm telling you, I've lived this nightmare for 47 years.
Wow.
My final job, and I could go on and on. I mean, one of my jobs, my boss told me I was not allowed to work on call. I was not allowed to work overtime. And when I confronted my supervisor, he told me my wife was a nurse, and that if my wife made as much money as that, I didn't need the extra money. I was not included.
So this was about your wife being Hispanic, basically.
Yeah, just living that. I had guys put guns to their imaginary guns to my head and told me they had the solution for my problem.
Because you're married to a Hispanic woman.
And I've always been very liberal. Yes.
That's astonishing. Richard, thank you for sharing your story with us. I'm sorry to hear how it's turned out, but good on you for staying married 47 years. Louise and I will be there next week, 47 years. Thank you, Richard. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Welcome back. Wow, what an amazing day. George in Portland, Oregon. Hey, George, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Hey, I just wanted to talk about Fox News and right-wing hate radio, which you've been mentioning today.
Yeah, this is back on the topic of hate from an hour or so ago where, you know, I was talking about, I'm even seeing this with some of my neighbors. It's starting to, it just seems like it's everywhere. And Louise had this encounter on an airplane. Anyhow, to you, George. It's your turn.
Thank you. I feel like it's just not given enough stock. It's not really talked about enough. There was a movie documentary on Netflix, something about what they did to my father.
Yeah, Jen Seiko's The Brainwashing of My Dad is the title of the movie, and you can see it, I think, over on Hulu.
The thing that struck me most about that film was the actual physical characteristics of the man when he was under that spell. I mean, it's not something that I've heard anyone mention, but the look on his face, the tightness of the muscles in his face were different. He looked different.
That's right.
I think that there's people being brainwashed so thoroughly in our country for decades now. I mean, there's children whose parents are watching Fox News who never turn off the television. So these children are being raised hearing these things over day in and day out, how evil Democrats are, how evil liberals are. And all they really want to do with Trump is trigger the left. I mean, the man has no policy. He's not doing anything for any American. It's all about triggering the left. It's all about this blood sport now.
Yep, owning the libs is their phrase. And basically what it means is betraying your country. And I think it's just reprehensible. George, thank you for the call, and thanks for your thoughts. Larry in Santa Monica, it says you don't think that I should use the word maggot here to describe people who are wearing MAGA hats.
Yeah. Hey, Tom, how are you? I'm a total liberal. I literally bleed blue blood, but
well, it doesn't matter. I mean, you know, we can talk about this from any perspective.
Yeah, well, I just want to let you know I'm not a right.
It is disrespectful. I agree with you to call somebody wearing a MAGA hat a maggot.
Well, I don't mind disrespect. That's fine in political discourse, actually. But I think calling somebody a maggot is dehumanizing, and you know, that's dehumanizing war language. We have to be very careful with that. I mean, I understand your sentiment, and I'm not accusing you of hate or anything.
Because it's a non-human animal, you mean?
Because it's a non-human, right? Exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. So that's the one argument, Larry, that you know, causes me to stop and think, maybe I shouldn't call them maggots. I don't know. Let me think about that. It just, you know, what would Republicans call us if MAGA was our slogan? I'm pretty sure they'd be calling us maggots. But you're right. It is dehumanizing. Larry, thank you for the call. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
So Larry provokes a fascinating question. What do you call people who wear MAGA hats? We'll be back. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Separated by the Border, a birth mother, a foster mother, and a migrant child's 3,000-mile journey by Gina Thomas. This is from the introduction. How good is your Spanish? And would you be able to take in a 4-year-old girl? She's from Honduras and speaks minimal English. The social worker had texted me on a Friday afternoon. I sat at my desk, bent over my cell phone, reading and rereading the text. My thoughts traveled to Honduras, bachata, ballades, clothes hanging on the line. So many things in our lives seem to have prepared us for this moment. My son was attending a bilingual school. I'm a former ESL teacher, and my husband Andrew and I speak Spanish. Plus, Honduras already had a piece of my heart. As those thoughts came, I tried to push them away. The voice of logic came in loud and strong. We had just gotten into a routine with Emma, our foster daughter. 2 foster children and 2 biological children would be too much for us to handle. Our first month as foster parents taught us this, and for the sake of everyone involved, we knew it would be very unfair to try that again. A little later, the social worker called and left me a message saying, "It looks like the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the ORR, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, will get her on Monday in court. It'll only be the weekend. Call me back after you talk to Andrew." I asked Andrew when I got home, "We can manage 4 kids for one weekend, right?" He said he doubted it would last only a weekend, but I convinced him that if ORR and ICE were involved, they would get her on Monday. A few minutes later, I called our social worker and said that we'd do it. When I walked into the social worker's office, Julia was sitting there in a brand new bright pink Barbie t-shirt. The social worker said they'd found the t-shirt in their clothing closet and Julia wanted it. Beautiful, soft onyx curls framed the girl's umber face. Her dark complexion made me speculate she was from a coastal region. She stood in dirty flip-flops next to the social worker's chair, chit-chatting away in Spanish without a care in the world. "Julia's been talking my ear off," the social worker said. "She's so sweet, but I have no idea what she's saying." Another worker brought in a black tote bag with a few other items from the clothing closet, including a pair of sequined high-top sneakers that Julia had picked out. I began to speak to Julia, pronounced Julia, in Spanish. She seemed happy to hear her mother tongue, but her body language didn't budge. I read that signal loud and clear, so I kept my distance and sat down on the floor. "¿Cómo se llama?" I asked. "Julia." "¿Cuántos años tienes?" "How old are you?" "Cuatro," 4. She looked older than 4 to me. I had been told her parents were deported and she was left behind. She was under federal jurisdiction. I would find out later this was all misinformation. I signed some papers and said, "We'll see you on Monday." I asked Julia if she would come stay with me and my family for the weekend. She smiled. I told her I had 3 other kids. Her eyes expanded with excitement. On the drive home, she jolted my Spanish from its slumber. The social worker wasn't kidding about how much this little one talked. On April 6, 2018, U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced a new zero-tolerance policy in which the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice would partner for the sake of prosecuting illegal entry into the United States. Sessions said, quote, "If you cross this border unlawfully, then we will prosecute you. It's that simple. If you smuggle aliens across our border, then we will prosecute you. If you are smuggling a child, then we will prosecute you, and that child will be separated from you as required by law. If you don't like that, then don't smuggle children over our border." End quote. 6 weeks later, almost 2,000 children had been separated from their parents at the border since the zero-tolerance policy took effect. When Sessions announced the administration's new policy, I couldn't comprehend the cruelty. I also wondered if it explained why a preschooler was living under my roof. Julia had come to live with me and my family in February of 2018, and it felt surreal to be a part of her story. She had first been separated from her mother, Guadalupe, called by her nickname Lupe through the rest of this book, by smugglers who were paid to bring them across the border. Julia had then been separated from her stepfather, Carlos, by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, likely because what was recognized by the Honduran government as stepfather was not recognized by the U.S. government as the same, a detail I didn't understand until an immigration expert read the first draft of this book and explained it. Julia had already suffered much trauma, and separating her from her stepfather had only inflicted more. The weight of the trauma that we, as a nation, began inflicting on vulnerable children and their parents was cruel and unusual punishment. When I heard that my own country was going to begin separating children regularly from their parents as a policy, it broke me. Reality became surreal, and Andrew and I learned to live in it, separating the trauma from our emotions so that we could survive. As the veil of Oz is ever lifting from my white evangelical American eyes, what I now see is simply heartbreaking. Government-secured human rights are mostly for privileged white people. Julia is not white. Julia is undocumented. Julia's first language is Spanish. Julia is a girl. These are all labels that set her back in a society made by and for white, passport-holding, English-speaking males. But God, who is neither white nor male, despite my use of the pronoun he, shines his good news on every human being alike. The book is Separated by the Border by Gina Thomas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.
Thom Hartmann Cruise will be sailing in July of 2020. The 7-day Oceania cruise will be going to Bermuda, and I'll be hosting onboard events about the topics of the day. More info at thomhartmann.com or 800-856-1155. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. So, Gordon Sondland, who is the Portland, Oregon hotelier, or is that hotelier? I don't know, whatever. He, who gave $1 million to Donald Trump, and in exchange, Donald Trump made him the U.S. ambassador to the EU. This is how that seems to work. He has now updated his testimony. This is breaking news. Gordon Sondland says, in fact, there was a quid pro quo. He was aware of it, and he was hanging out with Mike Pence when Mike Pence was laying it out to Mr. Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, on September 1st. It's like, these are all my words, not his. He said in this addendum that he just basically filed with Congress, and it's essentially under oath. This is sworn testimony. He says that when Mr. Taylor and when Timothy Morrison testified, now these are both, Morrison is a senior director for Europe and Russia at the National Security Council, and Taylor's with the State Department. When these guys testified that, in fact, there was an attempt at bribery and extortion by Donald Trump of the Ukrainians. They refer to it as a quid pro quo on CNN, but it's bribery and extortion. We need to start using the right words. That when these attempts at bribery and extortion happened, he kind of forgot. And so when he testified before Congress, a week or so ago, he kind of, it sort of seemed that way, and I was uncomfortable, but I don't know. And now he's saying, yep, sure enough. He says that their testimony, Taylor's and Morrison's testimony, has, quote, refreshed my memory. My recollection, that was his quote, refreshed my recollection. And so, the net is tightening, shall we say. The New York Times has a piece about this. It just published minutes ago. It's by Michael Schmidt. The headline, Sondland updates impeachment testimony describing Ukraine quid pro quo. Again, why the Latin? Why not say bribery? Attempted bribery. Attempted extortion. Alleged extortion. What's this quid pro quo stuff? Why do we have to describe things in Latin that most Americans don't have any idea what you're talking about? The article, the new account, again, reading from this article, the new account suggested that Mr. Sondland may not have been completely forthcoming with Mr. Taylor, and that he was, in fact, aware that the aid was contingent upon the investigations. In the updated testimony, Mr. Sondland recounted how he had discussed the linkage with Andriy Yermak, a top advisor to President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, on the sidelines of a September 1 meeting between Vice President Mike Pence and Mr. Zelensky in Warsaw. Mr. Zelensky had discussed the suspension of aid with Mr. Pence, Mr. Sondland said. So Mike Pence is in the middle of this stuff. As we all kind of knew, but here now in sworn testimony from the U.S. ambassador to the European Union and a $1 million donor to the Trump campaign, we have a guy saying it, just coming right out and saying it. Yes, In fact, this is part of this is actually his sworn testimony. I quote, this is Gordon Sondland. I said that resumption of the U.S. aid would likely not occur until Ukraine provided the public anti-corruption statement that we had been discussing for many weeks. Now, of course, the public anti-corruption statement is Joe Biden's son was involved with a corrupt, some kind of corrupt scheme. It's all coming unraveled. And the media needs to stop calling it a quid pro quo. It's bribery and extortion. I mean, it's just straightforward stuff. Jonathan in Athens, Tennessee. Hey, Jonathan, what's on your mind?
Hey, how you doing? How you doing?
Good.
On that last thing you touched on Mike Pence, is there any way like he being investigated too?
Not yet, not formally.
Or not? I mean, like all that's coming now and stuff. That because I think I think that he probably should, and if he is, then that's going to throw all the Republicans in limbo because
it'll trigger.
Try to find like a candidate to run against,
Yeah, well, it'll trigger the cons. I mean, this or own the cons or whatever this language from the right is, because they will say, and this is, I can just hear Limbaugh right now saying it. They will say, and now it's really a coup because they're not only going after the president, they're going after the vice president as well. And if they can remove both of them from office at the same time, you know who becomes president? Nancy Pelosi, according to the Constitution. And that will be a complete change, and that's not what people, quack, quack, quack. I can hear it now. And I'm guessing that that's probably 90% of the reason why Democrats are treating Mike Pence with kid gloves right now. Amen. Spot on. I'm with you. Thanks a lot for the call. Letty in Brea, California, you wanted to get back to our discussion earlier about hate in America.
Yes, absolutely. I had an incident that happened on 4th of July, this past 4th of July. Mm-hmm. My family and I went to Las Vegas, and we decided to go to the theater. And we were in line. We were going through the phone because we're like members of the theater for coupons. It wasn't our turn to go yet. And this man behind us very rudely says, "Hey, pay attention." I didn't think anything of it. I said, "It's not our turn yet, sir. You don't have to be rude." And then he said, "Hispanics," in such a disdainful and just like he was disgusted by us. Him and my husband exchanged words, and that was it. We got our stuff. We went. We served our drinks. And I noticed he came to where we were at, and he served his drink. And right before he left, he leaned over and he said something to the effect of, "Hey, I have my pistola in my car." And pistola means gun.
Right. And
the first thing that came out of my mouth was like, "Oh, you're one of those," like, trying to be brave. And then it just clicked on me. I'm like, "You just threatened us." And people all around us suddenly were like, "Hey, did he just threaten you?" And it just like suddenly was very scary. And he just started taking off and just walking like nothing had happened.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very obvious that was what his problem was.
Yeah,
and I'm not being, exaggerating or like, I'm just, being too extreme things that are not there. There was no reason for him to come and say that and say pistola in Spanish. And just one more point, Tom. I don't care what the polls say at this point as far as people that back up, Trump. They're morally bankrupt.
Yep.
And they are okay with this. And, a month later was the El Paso shooting. And I look like those people that got shot. I sound like them. And I have similar backgrounds. And this is getting really ridiculous. This is my country, just like everybody else's. And this has to stop. And I'm very scared that this man might still be president in the next election. I mean, I just don't even know what to say anymore. This is getting way out of control.
Well, Letty, thank you for sharing your story with us. I'm so sorry to hear how you were treated. And I hope that we can all, and everybody listening right now or watching this program, will redouble their efforts and their commitment to get all of their friends and neighbors who are of, similar, of like mind and people of decent, just core human decency will reach out and say, no, this will not stand. This will not stand. CJ in Hoopeston, Illinois. Hey, CJ, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Glad to talk to you, a longtime listener, first-time caller.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm calling to give a shout-out to the FBI. I'm tired of this organization, this great organization, being trashed by our president.
Mm-hmm.
They did something awesome yesterday. I don't know if you're aware of it, but they arrested a domestic terrorist, a white supremacist who was going to attack the synagogue in Pueblo, Colorado.
That's right. You're absolutely right. In fact, that's in my stack of stories to rant about today that I have not yet gotten to. But we have an Al Qaeda and ISIS among us right now, and they're called white nationalists, white supremacists, and thank God the FBI is tracking these people now and taking care, and doing something about it. But it's what's so bizarre is, for how long, that they didn't, and these groups just grew like mushrooms. It's just.
Yeah, I agree with that. It seems like things are changing a little bit to the better, and I just like I say, I was out in Pueblo last week visiting my sister-in-law, who is a member of that congregation. So I just felt it was important to call and just make people aware of that. It's an awful thing, and
so she was a member of the synagogue who this guy was going to blow up.
Yes.
Wow, that's cutting close to the bone. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she's been extremely paranoid for over a year now because of the Pittsburgh shooting.
Tree of Life shooting. Yeah. And anti-Semitism is part and parcel of white supremacy. It's just it's a terrible thing. CJ, thank you for sharing the story with us. I appreciate it. George in Chicago. Hey, George, what's up?
Well, first I'd like to offer hearty congratulations to you and Louise on 47 happy years together.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that'll be next Monday. The 11th is our anniversary, and in fact, on that day, we're basically going to take the day off. So anyhow, what's up?
Well, that'll make a 3-day weekend.
Yeah, well, Jefferson Smith is going to fill in for me. He's going to do a live show here. He does a marvelous show, so we're looking forward to it.
And briefly, might I say that characterizing Trump supporters as maggots is unfairly maligning the maggot that has a very useful role in nature.
Well, we were just talking about that, Nate and I, just a few minutes ago. Nate and Sean and I. It's like maggots are creepy, and no, maggots actually. They're part of nature's great recycling machine. They recycle dead stuff basically into soil and nutrients and stuff, and they're just embryonic flies or larval flies, I guess, literally. So yeah, okay.
And even today they have medical applications where they can clean out wounds better than just about anything.
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
The main problem is simply this. This outrageous assault on the telephone systems of Democratic congressmen. There's a precedent for this. I wish I could recall what presidential year this was.
Up in New Hampshire, you're talking about?
Yeah, but it was a Republican phone banking operation in Virginia that overloaded all the Democratic offices on Election Day, so people couldn't call for rides to the polls or where their polling place was, or campaign workers to check in for their instructions,
et
cetera.
I think that was 2000.
People were arrested and prosecuted and sent to prison for that. So I would urge everybody to call your congressman and call the Speaker's office and say, contact the relevant U.S. attorneys. We want an investigation and we want prosecutions for this.
Yeah, I think that was the 2004 election, but I could be wrong.
You're right. It was Kerry's election.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. That was my recollection. And the guys had some connection to New Hampshire, or maybe it was in New Hampshire that they were shutting down the voting. But yes, I remember it. Sort of well. George, thanks a lot for the call. You're right. I mean, this is another Republican trick, right? This is the kind of stuff Roger Stone was an expert at, shutting down the elections. If you can't win fair, steal it.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Or more accurately, if you can't win fair, cheat. The Republican motto. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Ellis in Honolulu, Hawaii. Hey, Ellis, what's up?
Hey, thank you. Yeah, cheat, lie, steal, and kill. All of those are values.
Tragically, it seems.
So, which actually separates us. This isn't what I was going to talk about, but it's almost as though you can tell who's going to be in which camp by whether they are willing to lie, cheat, steal, or harm.
Well, there's a huge caveat to that, Ellis, and that is if you talk to, there's a lot of really, good-hearted people in the white Christian evangelical movement who have become followers of Donald Trump, what I was previously calling maggots, and they're being lied to. I mean, this is I think it's in John.
Absolutely, they're being lied to.
Yeah,
and
warning.
This comes to my topic.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead with your topic.
So, you keep saying Fox hate, and there's one other term you use. If you've been paying attention to Rachel Maddow recently, you may have seen, especially the last week or so, that more and more connections are being made of Russian money into different things. And I think it might be useful. I would invite you to consider calling Fox News and so-called hate radio Russian-sponsored, because we can bet, just like we saw Russian impact in the NRA, the policies of Reagan that you were talking about being put in, I think that we can see connection back to white supremacists, Nazis who are attempting to re-arise, and Russians who have created sort of a, and there's a couple of others in the group, they got scooped up, the evangelicals and the Qs. I think those are more the good-hearted people that got fooled.
Yeah.
But the ones who would like to undo democracy have an unholy alliance, if you will. And I think that we can go way back on this.
Yeah, my concern about being...
And then, go ahead, and then there's one other thing.
My concern about being that specific about it is that what we are learning is that it's not just Russia and it's not just Russians. In fact, the principal oligarch, Dmitry Firtash, who looks like he's the guy who was putting up the money that Lev and Igor were using to pay Rudy Giuliani $500,000 and do dirty tricks for Donald Trump, he's a Ukrainian billionaire. And you've got, the billionaires who bailed out Jared Kushner, they were Middle Eastern billionaires. Seth Abramson wrote this book, Proof of Conspiracy.
Well,
hang on just a second. Seth Abramson's book, Proof of Conspiracy, lays out that there's actually this network of billionaire oligarchs from 6 different countries. The only one that's a functioning democracy is Israel, but, Israel, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and I forget the other 2 right off the top of my head, but it's all in Seth's book. And he was on this program talking about it. I think what we're looking at is not so much, Putin and the Russian government sitting down and saying, we're going to mess with democracies all around the world. I think it's a bunch of oligarchs sitting around saying, how can we mess with governments all around the world? And they're very nice to the governments that are run by strongman, the Erdogan in Turkey or
right.
Putin in
they
Russia.
Absolutely woo them.
Right.
I can see that happening.
But I think the problem is the oligarchs, not the countries.
Let's look at Russian money to the senators and representatives as well.
Yeah, $7 million in the last election cycle went to Mitch McConnell and a couple of other Republican senators. I think there was 3 of them altogether. I was talking about it on Tuesday, or on Monday, excuse me. Ellis, thank you for the call. It's good to hear from you. We'll be right back. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and Norma in Inverness, Florida. Hey, Norma, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. How are you?
I'm well. What's up? What's up?
I just wanted to express that people teach their children, if not by rote, by actions. My granddaughter was around 4 years old, and she was playing with what then she thought was her best friend, who was a little boy, and he decided that he was going to jump on her while she was on the couch. And thankfully, my daughter-in-law and my son had taught her to take care of herself, and she propelled him off the other end of the couch and hurt his family jewels, and told him never to do that again. She didn't like it. And where he learned that from is his father, who beats his mother and hates women.
Oh, geez. See, I think there's two levels of this, Norma. It's, yes, some people learn hate in their families, and they learn it the way that they grow up, and even just having authoritarian parents. But there's also mother culture. I was talking with a couple of free speech donors the other day, and talking about how, when I was growing up, all of the characterizations of people of color on television, which is mother culture. I mean, it's how, television is one of our great trainers, right? One of the things it teaches us. We're all either bad guys or buffoons. And so there's this automatic voice that pops up in my head when I confront or come into contact with people of color that is suggesting that they're probably like that. And intellectually, inside my own head, I have to say, no, stop, wait a minute. No, we're all people here. Because that's how I grew up. I mean, that's the world in which I grew up. And I'm guessing, and I've had this conversation with a number of people, particularly my age, people in their 60s, that these haunt us. And we've got to overcome this stuff. Back to you, Norma.
I know. And I have a friend, a relative, who calls all the MAGA people, including their chief, the Mango Mobster and the Mango Mobsters. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, that's colorful, but it's not quite as colorful as maggots. Norma, thank you for the call. Geez, we've got, we have 10 seconds left. I'm sorry. Just, by the way, be sure to check out this. The story I have is from the New York Times. There's probably one from the Washington Post. There's probably one from the Financial Times about Sondland updating his testimony. Basically now, the guy who gave $1 million to Donald Trump to become the EU ambassador is now basically saying, yep, bribery and extortion. Now, he's not using those words. The media's not using those words. I think they all should be using those words. But the headline in the New York Times uses the phrase quid pro quo, which is Latin, basically, for bribery. So, anyhow, share the media that you're hearing this show on with your friends and neighbors. Tell them, hey, there's some progressive media out there, not just my show, but all the rest. Tell them about it. Spread the word. Pass it along. Get out there. Get active. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires you. Tag, you're it. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Separated by the Border, a birth mother, a foster mother, and a migrant child's 3,000-mile journey by Gina Thomas. This is from the introduction. How good is your Spanish? And would you be able to take in a 4-year-old girl? She's from Honduras and speaks minimal English. The social worker had texted me on a Friday afternoon. I sat at my desk, bent over my cell phone, reading and rereading the text. My thoughts traveled to Honduras. Bachata, ballades, clothes hanging on the line. So many things in our lives seem to have prepared us for this moment. My son was attending a bilingual school. I'm a former ESL teacher. And my husband, Andrew, and I speak Spanish. Plus, Honduras already had a piece of my heart. As those thoughts came, I tried to push them away. The voice of logic came in loud and strong. We had just gotten into a routine with Emma, our foster daughter. 2 foster children and 2 biological children would be too much for us to handle. Our first month as foster parents taught us this, and for the sake of everyone involved, we knew it would be very unfair to try that again. A little later, the social worker called and left me a message saying, "It looks like the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the ORR, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, will get her on Monday in court. It'll only be the weekend. Call me back after you talk to Andrew." I asked Andrew when I got home, "We can manage 4 kids for one weekend, right?" He said he doubted it would last only a weekend, but